Massachusetts. This court is now in session. You may be seated.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and thank you, as I have every morning, for your consistent punctuality. I have a series of questions for all of you. If the answer to any of my questions is yes, please raise your hand. Otherwise, there's no need to respond verbally to any of my questions. Any of the jurors have any difficulty following the instructions of the court not to discuss the case among themselves or with anybody else? Any of the jurors have any difficulty following the instructions of the court not to do any independent investigation concerning this case and avoid any information from any source other than within the courtroom? Is there any serious and substantial issue involving your jury duty that you need to alert the court to at this time? None of the jurors have answered affirmatively. The court has made a decision having nothing to do with your role as the sole and exclusive judges of the facts of the case to remove the armed robbery of credit cards from your consideration. You should not in any way consider that in your role as the sole and exclusive judges of the facts of the case as to the indictments before the court. A very brief instruction on closing arguments before we go into closing arguments. Each side has up to 45 minutes for the closing arguments. The important things to keep in mind about closing arguments are as follows. While the lawyers will certainly suggest to you and argue to you as it relates to the credibility of the witnesses, since you are the sole and exclusive judges of the facts of the case, they can't give you their own personal opinion as it relates to credibility of witnesses. So if you hear terms like I think, I feel, I believe, you know that it is the prosecutor may suggest, but they may not tell you what they think of the credibility of the witnesses. Secondly, in order to be able for the lawyers to structure their closing arguments, they will inevitably touch upon the law to give context to their argument. I will instruct you on the law, however, you must accept my instruction, whether you believe or accept those instructions, whether you believe them to be proper or not. Finally, I tell you that the closing arguments may not appeal to emotion, passion, prejudice, or sympathy. Commonwealth bears the burden of proof on each of the indictments by the standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt, has the benefit of arguing last. Therefore, we'll hear from Ms. Regan first on behalf of Mr. Chism.
Philip Chism, a kind, smart 14-year-old, committed these terrible acts when he was in the throes of a serious mental illness. Now, before I talk to you about the evidence in this case, I want to acknowledge the pain and terrible grief that Philip Chism's actions caused. Philip Chism's actions took a wonderful person from this world. I told you at the beginning of this case, it's not in question who did these terrible acts. And the evidence has borne me out. Now, each of you was selected from hundreds of jurors during a long impanelment process. And the reason each of you is on this jury is because the court, the prosecutor, the defense, and you were confident that you could decide this case based on the evidence and not the sometimes overwhelming grief and emotion that's filled this courtroom. The defense acknowledges the enormity of this task and thanks you for your commitment to this. Now, the evidence is clear that Philip Chism has suffered from a psychotic disorder, most likely early onset schizophrenia, from the time he was young. Now, what's the evidence of that? Well, first you have the testimony of 3 experienced psychiatrists, Dr. Dudley, Dr. DeVere, and Dr. Jackson. And I'm going to talk about each one of them a little bit and their role in this case. Dr. Dudley is a psychiatrist who's been practicing since the 1970s. He's done many, many forensic evaluations in all sorts of contexts: family court, juvenile court, criminal court, death penalty cases. And he has a thorough, studied approach to his evaluation of a juvenile defendant or an adult defendant. But that's not all that Dr. Dudley brings to this case. Dr. Dudley brings to this case the experience of more than 30 years of treating severely mentally ill teenagers and adults. He's told you that he has treated them for years on end, watching the course of their illness and prescribing them medication and witnessing, observing, and studying their symptoms. This is something that Dr. Kincherf does not bring. Dr. Kincherf is a very learned psychologist, and he has done many, many evaluations and many consultations of children and teens with psychosis. But he hasn't done the weekly, long-term observation of someone who is severely mentally ill. And when you boil this case down, it's important to realize the experience of hallucinations, of auditory hallucinations, of command hallucinations, is an internal experience. And the reason the experts testify is that you, if you choose, can rely on their expert and learned opinion, their evaluation of the credibility of the symptoms. And Dr. Dudley brings years and years of very relevant experience to his evaluation. And he is the person that gave you his opinion that Philip Chism lacked criminal responsibility on October 22nd, 2013. Now, another psychiatrist that testified was Dr. DeVere. Now, Dr. DeVere did not give an opinion about Philip Chism. She had never met him. She was what we call an educational witness. And what she gave you is the background and the structure for you that would allow you to evaluate Dr. Dudley's testimony and his evaluation of Philip Chism. I think it would be hard to find someone more experienced on psychosis with children than Dr. DeVere. She's the head of a clinic at UMass Medical Center where she treats children with psychosis and teenagers with psychosis. This has been the focus of her career. And I'd suggest to you that she knows what she's talking about. The third psychiatrist was Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson is a child and adolescent psychiatrist who has spent his career, also since the 1970s, dealing with the sickest children and teenagers that there are. The children that are hospitalized, the teenagers that are hospitalized. And what he brought to this was a lens for you to compare Dr. Dudley's evaluation to. He showed you how careful you have to be, a doctor has to be, when evaluating a very troubled teen. Dr. Jackson knew about the malingering, knew about the exaggeration of symptoms, but he didn't just say, all right, that's enough, consideration done, evaluation done, because he realized that severely mentally ill teenagers and adults don't have the best judgment. They're going to exaggerate. They're in terrible turmoil. So what did he do? He looked behind that inflammatory information and looked at the teenager, looked at the boy. And what did he see? He saw, putting aside the hallucinations, the commands, the delusions, he saw other significant symptoms. He saw disorganization of thought. He saw flat affect. He saw social withdrawal. And he treated those things with an antipsychotic medication, risperidol. This was not that long ago. And what happened? There was a marked change in Philip, not based on Philip Chism's report, but based on Dr. Jackson's observations of him every working day while he was in the hospital, about 20 days. Now, Dr. Dudley's opinion, you saw Dr. Dudley on the stand, and you saw that he was a considered person who brought a serious perspective to his evaluation of Philip Chism. And he told you that the most important part of his evaluation was his interviews with Philip. 7 interviews over a number of months, 2 to 4 hours in length. Now, you don't have to rely on Dr. Dudley's opinion that the interview is an important part of the evaluation, because Dr. DeVere told you that interviews are the most important part of her evaluation too. And Dr. Dudley, when he interviewed Philip, didn't just take Philip at his word. He spoke to Philip Chism about his childhood, his history, the significant events. He observed his mental functioning, observed his moods, observed his physical symptoms. He listened carefully to what Philip Chism had to say about the hallucinations, about the command hallucinations, and he evaluated it against his experience and his knowledge. And then he took that evaluation and he compared it and evaluated in light of all the material that he had. He didn't just take Philip at his word. He had a nuanced approach, and he looked at 25 or more interviews of people that knew Philip in Tennessee, interviews of the students that were around Philip when he was at Danvers High School, records concerning Philip. He spoke at length with Philip's mother. He spoke at length with a social worker that worked with Philip after the event when he was in custody. He looked at the police reports. He looked at the videos. He didn't visit the scene and walk through it, but he gave a very careful consideration to everything that he had. And what did he find? He found that it was consistent with Philip having a psychotic disorder, most likely early onset schizophrenia. And I'd just like to point out that Dr. Dudley told you that in the interviews he observed what Dr. DeVere called the negative symptoms: social withdrawal, flat affect, disorganized thinking. But you don't have to rely solely on Dr. Dudley's report of this, because Dr. Jackson saw those same symptoms not too long ago when Philip was in the hospital. Now, how did we come to be here today? How did this happen? If we go through the course of Philip's illness, it will be consistent with what Dr. DeVere told you about psychosis in children. First, Philip Chism was born into a family with I'd say, serious and substantial history of severe mental illness. His maternal grandmother and his maternal aunt have multiple hospitalizations for psychotic illness, and you're going to have those records. His grandmother had many electric shock treatment. And you heard from his grandfather that it seemed that the onset of the illness, and his grandmother in particular, and his grandfather's wife, Eduardo, who testified, his wife, that it was sudden, that all of a sudden she was fine and then she wasn't. Well, we know from Dr. DeVere that's not the case. The problem is that the symptoms fester under the surface for a long time until there's an acute episode. And that's what happened to his grandmother, and that's what happened to Philip. Now, Philip began, Dr. Dudley told you that Philip began hearing voices when he was 10 years old. And that's consistent with what Dr. DeVere told you. Dr. DeVere told you that children suffer with these symptoms, the voices, the social withdrawal, the anxiety, the humiliation of the voices, for years without anyone noticing. That's common. And why is that? Why don't children and teens seek help? Well, It's important to think about how a child would view these voices. A child doesn't know any other reality. A child doesn't know what other people's internal experience is. A child doesn't have the knowledge to evaluate what's happening to him, and we all know that many times adults aren't able to cope with this either. And this illness brings terrible fear and shame, and that's what happened to Philip. And you heard from Dr. DeVere, this is the usual course. Well, how was Philip able to function so well in Tennessee if he had this terrible illness? Well, we know from Dr. Dudley and Dr. DeVere that two things are very important in determining whether a child can cope with early onset schizophrenia, psychosis. And the two things are, one, are they able to distract themselves? Dr. DeVere told you that the more intelligent the child, the better they are at hiding their illness, and that these children use sports, they use school, they use keeping busy, they use comic books, they use video games, they use music, whatever can distract them from the voices in their head. Dr. Dudley told you another very important thing that children use to manage their illness is a support system. And Philip Chism had a great support system in Tennessee. And you heard from some of the people there. Those people that testified loved Philip very much. And the Carters treated him almost like a son. The coach, Claudia Rodriguez, he had people he could turn to. He had a community. He knew a lot of people, and a lot of people knew him and respected him. Unfortunately, the move to Massachusetts was catastrophic for Philip. He lost his entire support system. He was all alone. He had his mother, that was the only adult, and she was doing the best that she could, but she had 3 kids, all starting in new schools. Now, the stress of the move from Tennessee to Massachusetts to Danvers can't be underestimated. And Dr. Jackson, Dr. DeVere, and Dr. Dudley told you that stress can trigger an acute psychotic episode. And it did. Chism was under enormous stress when he started high school at Danvers High School. He was a 14-year-old freshman boy going to a school where he knew no one. He was an unusually tall African-American boy in a predominantly white school who had no place to hide. And in the beginning, he did well. He held it together. He was friendly, he was smiling, he was a success at the soccer team. But as the weeks continued on at Danvers High School, he began to get sicker. He was less able to cope. And it's not surprising that it was the 14, 15-year-old girls that were around him that noticed the change and not the teachers. And what they noticed is that he began to be more socially withdrawn. His affect was flat. He stopped responding to people. He stopped working in groups. These are not dramatic symptoms. And as Dr. DeVere told you, they're often not seen as significant, but seen as just teenage angst, what a kid is going through. But what Dr. DeVere told you and what Dr. Dudley told you is that when professionals then look back after they have the information of the acute psychotic break, the benefit of it, then they realize just how significant these subtle symptoms were. Now, on the day of the terrible events, Philip was not himself. Gilberto Perez said that he was extremely quiet, that he didn't respond when Miss Ritzer talked to him, that he had his earphones in for the entire class and was drawing. Autumn Ciani, who was in the classroom with Philip and Miss Ritzer after school, told you she had never seen Philip the way that he was. He was aggravated. And most importantly, she said that when Miss Ritzer was talking to him, he was mumbling and talking to himself and looking out the window. The same symptoms, the same behavior that Dr. Dudley brought his experienced eye to. Now, when Philip Chism followed Miss Ritzer into that bathroom, he was not himself. He was not the kind, smart 14-year-old boy. He was totally and absolutely responding to the terrible command hallucinations that were in his head. He didn't choose to do this. Now, just finding that Philip Chism has a mental illness is the inquiry of whether Philip Chism has a serious mental illness or not is not the only inquiry that you have. You also have to decide whether Philip Chism was able to conform his behavior to the law. Now, the first thing you have in that consideration is Dr. Dudley's testimony. Dr. Dudley listened to Philip, talked to Philip about the events, had 7 interviews with him. Dr. Dudley reviewed the reports, how Philip was before, how Philip was after. He talked to his mother, he talked to the clinician, the social worker. He looked to see if the pieces fit together. And what he found was that Philip was in an acute psychotic episode. He was under the command of those hallucinations. But you don't have to just rely on Dr. Dudley's testimony. You can rely on your common sense. How could a 14-year-old boy cope with acute psychotic episode? You heard about the juvenile brain and how the juvenile brain has an effect on teenagers and makes them very different from adults. They have difficulty with making decisions under stress, with controlling their impulses. And Philip was no ordinary 14-year-old boy. He was a 14-year-old boy with the burden of this progressive illness. Now, I have to use notes, and I apologize. Now, you also can bring your common sense to Dr. Dudley's opinion. Philip Chism was a loved boy. He was welcomed into the Carter family home. He was the calm anchor on a soccer team full of rambunctious kids. And you can ask yourself, what other than an overpowering mental illness could cause Philip Chism to do these acts? Now, the Commonwealth wants you to evaluate Philip Chism's mental illness through a made-for-TV stereotype of mental illness. If someone is acutely psychotic, everyone would notice. But we know that's not necessarily true. Dr. DeVere, with all her experience, said that she could interview a floridly psychotic, acutely psychotic child for 30 minutes and not realize that they were psychotic. The Commonwealth may argue that Philip Chism did well on a history test, so boom, he wasn't mentally ill, he wasn't psychotic, he could control himself. But Dr. Dudley told you that intellect remains. Philip, when he was psychotic, didn't become stupid. And Dr. DeVere told you that the smarter the child, the more able they are to hide it. Now, the Commonwealth may also want you to believe that once someone becomes acutely psychotic, out of touch with reality, responding to command hallucinations, they stay that way. But that's not the truth of the illness. We know that from the doctors that testified. The truth of the matter is that they have children and teenagers, they go along on a base level, they have an acute episode, and then they return to the base. And that acute episode can last hours or weeks. So evidence that Philip Chism behaved himself when he was in custody and didn't display any overtly psychotic symptoms doesn't add much to this discussion, because that's not the course of the disease. The Commonwealth may also argue that Philip Chism malingered on those psychological tests, which I'll talk to you a little more about in a little while. Anyway, use your common sense. This is a severely mentally ill teenager under the stress of the realization that he has done these terrible things. The fact that he exaggerates symptoms and doesn't report symptoms as accurately as their tests would want does not mean he's not mentally ill. Mentally ill teenagers make poor decisions just like mentally ill adults and just like regular teenagers. Dr. Hebben wrote in her report that these exaggerations, if that's what they were a cry for help. But we didn't hear any of that in her opinionated testimony. But you saw from Dr. Jackson in particular the way that psychological tests and evidence of exaggeration should be considered. And they should be considered as part of the big picture. Now, I want to talk to you about Philip Chism's behavior. Philip Chism's, when we look at his behavior after he left Miss Ritzer's body in the bathroom, we look at it, it shows the disorganized thought that is the hallmark of psychosis. First, why was he frantically going from place to place in and around the school for an hour and a half after he left the bathroom for the first time? That bathroom wasn't locked. It was covered with blood. Anyone could have walked in. The school wasn't completely empty. You saw that Kevin Hebert was there, Ramsey was there. I'm sure there were other students. Oh, we heard that the cross-country team was practicing, the soccer team was practicing. Anyone could have walked into that bathroom. If Philip Chism, it would be sensible for Philip Chism, given what he had done, to flee the scene. But he didn't. He just wandered in and out and around for a whole hour and a half. And the Commonwealth may say, well, he covered his face. But it made no sense what he did about his face. 1 minute it's covered, 1 minute it's not. In the middle of his time at the school, after leaving Miss Ritzer's body in the woods, he enters the school. He's covered with blood on his pants. He's barefoot. His face is exposed. It makes no sense. About an hour after he leaves Miss Ritzer for the first time in the bathroom, and after he's moved her body to the wooded area, he returns to the girl's bathroom for the third time. What sense does that make? It makes no sense. Now, the Commonwealth might say, oh, well, he knew he was doing wrong. He wasn't psychotic because he hid the body in the woods. Well, first of all, you were able to visit the scene, and you see that it's not very far into the woods. Now, at night, the scene it might not be obvious to someone coming onto the scene that something terrible had happened there. But anyone coming onto the scene in the daytime would know something was wrong. There were bags and clothes and shoes and knapsacks all strewn around. Also, at any time when he was in the woods, just that little bit into the woods, he could have been interrupted. Anyone could have walked into the scene. You heard from one of the students that testified that the cross-country team was practicing that day and that they ran in that woods, that there was a trail there. There were people playing sports in the parking lot all around. He very easily could have been discovered. This was not the clandestine actions that the Commonwealth would have you believe. And what about the scene that he left there? Was that rational? He left his knapsack, his shoes, his socks, his jeans, and even left in the knapsack there was his student ID, his homework with his name on it. This was not a calculated hiding of a crime. This was the act of someone with very disorganized thought. Now, the Commonwealth may talk about his interactions with Ramsey Escorcia or Kevin Herbert, and how he didn't seem completely crazy when they talked to him. But we know from Dr. DeVere and from Dr. Dudley that these short kinds of interactions often do not really reveal how psychotic a person is. And Ramsey did not say that Philip Chism was fine, normal. He said something was very wrong with Philip. He had never seen Philip like that before. He was sweating, he was frantic, and Ramsey did not know what was wrong. Now, the Commonwealth may talk about the Philip Chisholm's use of Colleen Ritzer's credit cards as being a sign that he had a plan, he knew what he was doing, he was thinking clearly. But he used those credit cards and just went to a movie at the same place that he used the credit cards. Of course, someone in their right mind would think, my God, they can trace the credit cards. I better get out of here after I use it. But he didn't do that. And then you have the very significant testimony of the Topsfield police officers, which happened quite a few weeks ago. Now, what they told you is Philip was not right when they saw him walking on the side of the road. First of all, does it make any sense for a 14-year-old boy in shorts on a late October night to be walking along Route 1, old Route 1, in the dark? Where was he going? What's there? There's nothing there. It makes no sense. It's certainly not a getaway plan. And how did Philip appear to those officers? He appeared to have a flat affect. He appeared to be socially withdrawn. He exhibited the symptoms, the negative symptoms of a psychotic disorder. Now, if you could give me a minute. I want to talk to you about the Commonwealth's experts and the reason you should question their opinions. Dr. Kincher, first, he was ill-served by Dr. Hebben. He asked Dr. Hebben to evaluate Philip for psychosis and malingering. But Dr. Hebben took it upon herself to prove that Philip was a liar. She never got to the psychosis. Her approach was biased and ill-conceived. She met with Philip once for 3 hours, 11:30 to 2:30, no break, no lunch. And during that time, she gave him over 900 questions, true or false, never, sometimes, always. She didn't draw him out. She didn't talk to him. She gave him tests, one right after another. And the selection of the tests was extremely biased. She gave him 7 tests. 5 she used to conclude he was malingering. And the 2 others she just ignored because of the malingering. That's not an objective evaluation. She went in with an agenda. Now, and I also asked her about specific questions in the test and the MFAST. And you saw how tricky those questions were. And you heard that the MFAS is not, the manual says, do not use it with adolescents. But she used it anyway. And she used a test that really is based on tricks with a very troubled adolescent under tremendous stress. That's not fair and it's not right. The test that she gave Philip suggests the answers. There were 900 questions that every one of them suggests the answer. And as Dr. Dudley told you, that is not the approach you want to take, because children and teens are easily led. They're easily influenced. But she had none of that. You saw her. She had an agenda, she fulfilled it, and she wasn't backing down by her opinion. And Dr. Kincher's own evaluation is flawed by some of the same flaws of Dr. Hebbins, because he too gave Philip the psychological test that suggests the answer. They gave Philip the two tests about dissociative experiences. And again, they were tests where you just had to say to what intensity you had to have these symptoms. It wasn't the very careful, non-suggestive approach that Dr. Dudley brought to the evaluation, or that Dr. DeVere would bring, or that Dr. Jackson would bring. It was a result-oriented evaluation. Now, another reason that you should have a doubt about Dr. Kincher's testimony is his explanation about why Philip did these acts makes no sense. He said that Philip was in extreme emotional distress when he did this. But think about your common experience. 14-year-old adolescent boys do get distressed, and they do sometimes get extremely distressed. But what do when that happens? They paint graffiti on a wall, they get drunk, they don't do their homework, they skip school, and maybe they go so far as to steal a car. But they don't do these bizarre and horrible acts. Something more is going on, and Dr. Kincher missed it. Finally, Dr. Kincher missed the boat. He never really considered just how young Philip Chism was when he did this. If I remember correctly, he testified all on direct and never mentioned a consideration of what it means for a 14-year-old boy, to do these things. It was only when I asked him on cross, he said, "Oh yes, I always consider that." But how does it make sense? How does it make sense that the Philip Chism that everyone knew did these things? It makes no sense at all unless something really, really awful was going on, unless he was suffering from a terrible mental illness. Now, I need to address an area of the evidence that's very difficult to talk about, but necessary to talk about. And I need to really use my notes for this part. The court will instruct you that you may only convict Philip Chism of a crime if the Commonwealth proves each element beyond a reasonable doubt. That emotion can't get in the way. Even your condemnation of the act that Philip committed cannot get in the way. You have to follow the law and put the Commonwealth to the test. And there is one charge, the unnatural rape charge, which Philip Chism did not commit because Colleen Ritzer died in the bathroom. Now, the court is going to instruct you that in order for a rape to occur, Miss Ritzer has to be alive, or the alleged rape must occur very closely in time, almost simultaneously with her death. The Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the alleged rape, the cause of death, were tied together by a unity of time, place, and circumstance. And for the unnatural rape, the rape with the branch, Miss Ritzer was not alive, and it was not almost simultaneously with her death. And why is that? Well, first, we know that the injuries to her neck were severe. We know at least one of the wounds cut her trachea, her jugular, her carotid, and that cut, I think it's the D wound, would cause immediate death and massive bleeding. And we also know where the blood was found in this case. It was found in the bathroom. We heard from the cleaner that there was blood from the last store to the door. He had never seen anything like it. It was a tremendous amount of blood. Now, the Commonwealth may say, well, he could have done some of the injuries in the bathroom and some of the injuries in the woods. But we know, I would suggest that you'll find that the fatal wound was committed in the bathroom, not in the woods where the branch was used. Because there's very little blood in that barrel, and there's very little blood where her body was found. So if you have a reasonable doubt about where Colleen Ritzer died, you must find Philip Chism not guilty of the unnatural rape count. Now, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Philip Chism did not suffer from a mental illness that caused him to be unable to conform his behavior to the law. The defense did not put on and does not argue that he didn't know he was doing wrong. But the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Philip Chism was criminally responsible. It's not enough for you to say he probably was, he most likely was, he possibly was. The standard is beyond a reasonable doubt to a moral certainty. This is a really hard case. This is a really painful case to contemplate. But the law gives you guidance. The law says that you must hold the Commonwealth to its burden. You must decide it on the evidence. And if you have a reasonable doubt, you have a duty to acquit. Now, it's your duty to examine every bit of the evidence, every word of testimony, all the exhibits. And after examining all that evidence, if you have one reasonable doubt, it's your duty to acquit. Now, you have to be convinced to a moral certainty despite the testimony of Dr. DeVere, Dr. Dudley, Dr. Jackson. You have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt despite the Philip Chism's strong family history of psychosis. You have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt despite the lack of any explanation about why this boy would do this thing. You have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the bizarre nature of the offense doesn't call into question his mental status. And you have to be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt despite his erratic behavior, inexplicable behavior, after he left Miss Ritzer in the bathroom. Well, I have nothing more to say. And at this time, the responsibility of 16-year-old Philip Chism's case passes from my shoulders to yours. And I don't get to respond to Ms. McDougall's closing argument, but I'd ask you, when you deliberate, to think about how I would respond. And at the end of this, now, I'm asking you if you would return a verdict of not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility for the juvenile Philip Chism. Thank you.
Sure.
Ladies and gentlemen, the terrible, horrible event of October 22nd, 2013 didn't unfold in a screen capture. They didn't unfold in a still image. They happened in real time, in real life, in a place at a time, at Danvers High School, in the middle of what should have been a normal day, in the middle of the afternoon. And make no mistake, they didn't happen to Philip Chism. He did these terrible things to Colleen Ritzer, and she was only 24 years old. And the only still image that matters in this case is the image of Colleen in the woods. The image that the defendant painted of Colleen stripped, battered, brutalized, and violated, framed by the fallen fence, the defendant's school bag discarded nearby with his ID, like some kind of terrible signature. That is the only still image in this case that tells you what was happening in the mind of Philip Chism on October 22nd, 2013. And that's the image that Dr. Dudley, despite his thorough preparation, never considered. Because what did he say about the sexual aspect of this crime? Well, it left him with a lot of questions. Questions he didn't do much to answer. Because there were no answers in the only sources of information he actually relied on. What the defendant told him and what the defendant's mother told him. Because, ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear, that is the sole basis for Dr. Dudley's opinion. If Philip Chism didn't start hearing voices when he's 10, then there is no evidence that Philip Chism began experiencing psychosis at 10. And if Philip Chism wasn't hearing voices, and the only basis I would suggest to you of that opinion was Philip Chism, then Philip Chism isn't mentally ill. Early onset schizophrenia. What did Dr. DeVere tell you? And let's be very clear, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. DeVere has never met Philip Chism. Dr. DeVere has never evaluated Philip Chism. Dr. DeVere has no opinion about Philip Chism. And Dr. DeVere told you the frequency of early onset schizophrenia is 1 in 10,000, less than 1%. And you heard from the people in Tennessee. Wonderful, loving people with background in child development. They didn't see anything. Going to your friend's house because your family is chaotic is not coping with a mental illness. It's a survival skill by a teenager growing up in less than ideal circumstances. Putting your earbuds in is not coping with mental illness, or apparently most of Danvers High is suffering from mental illness because they're all allowed to wear one earbud. But Dr. Dudley doesn't look any further than the 90% of his opinion, and I would suggest to you it's even more than that, that relies on Philip Chism. Well, that's not a luxury you have, ladies and gentlemen. You don't get to put your head in your hands or rub your forehead. You have to consider all of the evidence in this case. And you didn't get those videos as still images in a vacuum or as disjointed videos without time or place. Because like Dr. Kinshirf, you were able to walk through the halls of Danvers High School. You were able to see where Philip Chism was going, and I would suggest to you, you were able to infer why. And let's be very clear, because even Dr. Dudley conceded this. If what Philip and Chism intended was what he did in the woods, then he doesn't flee the school. He finds a way to get Colleen into those woods. So what does the video tell us? It tells us that on the morning of October 22nd, 2013, Philip Chism arrived at Danvers High School not just with his school backpack, but with 2 other drawstring bags. Philip Chism arrived at Danvers High School that morning with everything he needed to do what he wanted to do. Philip Chism only brought his school backpack to that first class. Philip Chism, walking down the hall just minutes before Colleen Ritzer's class, interacting with his classmates, acting like a normal teenage boy. The classmates he didn't have any connection with, according to Dr. Dudley. And Philip Chism, after spending some time in his locker, going to Colleen Ritzer's classroom, wearing the red sweatshirt and carrying one of those drawstring bags that didn't contain his soccer clothes because his plan after school was not soccer. And these videos, ladies and gentlemen, that we've seen many times of Colleen going to the bathroom, Philip Chism coming into the hall, looking both ways, checking his pocket to make sure he has what he needs, ducking into the classroom to cover his head, making his way down the hall. As he crosses the stairwell, he slows his pace so he won't catch up with Colleen before she's in the bathroom, completely vulnerable, completely unaware, donning those gloves. You'll see when you watch the video on a smaller screen that even now he hesitates in the doorway of the bathroom as if listening for something to make sure she's completely unaware. Ladies and gentlemen, those videos alone give you deliberate premeditation. And now I'm going to talk about what happened in that bathroom for the next 11 minutes. And this is where I ask you to apply your common sense to what is senseless, to what is awful, to what is unimaginable. Because there was no disorganized thinking, and there was no chaos, and there were no voices. As terrible as it is, there was purposeful intent. We know that Philip Chism asphyxiated Colleen Ritzer in the bathroom. We know from Dr. McDonald that that would ultimately contribute to her death, but let me suggest to you that Colleen Ritzer was not strangled to death in the bathroom. Because Philip Chism had a box cutter. Philip Chism wanted to use that box cutter. It's the only reason to bring it into the bathroom. It's the only reason to use it as he ultimately did. Philip Chism asphyxiated Colleen Ritzer to incapacitate her, so that other than whatever contusions she may or may not have gotten in the initial struggle, she was incapacitated almost immediately. She was helpless. And we know that Philip Chism raped Colleen Ritzer in the bathroom. There are 2 sperm cells inside of her, and they are not a match to Philip Chism. They are consistent with his DNA profile at 8 locations, and the numbers are in the hundreds, not the quintillions that you heard for other evidence. But ladies and gentlemen, once again, this evidence is in a still image. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, because only one man was in that bathroom with Colleen Ritzer, and only one man carried her pants out, and only one man would sexually violate her in the woods, and only one man is caught with his pants down. So Philip Chism raped Colleen Ritzer in the bathroom. Does it make sense, ladies and gentlemen, that a teenage boy raped a young woman with that gaping neck wound? Does it make sense that he even had time to inflict the gaping neck wound? It's clear that Colleen was bleeding in the bathroom, bleeding a lot. You heard that just those injuries on either side of the gaping neck wound would have caused injuries, did cause injuries to her internal and external jugular, would have bled more slowly, but bled surely, leaking into her body and ultimately out of her body as she lay on the ground in the bathroom. But ladies and gentlemen, think about where the blood is when Philip Chism leaves the bathroom. And we know Philip Chism didn't get to finish what he started in the bathroom, because we know he was interrupted by Danielle Bedard. Danielle Bedard, who at the 11-minute mark walks in, sees what I would suggest to you were Philip Chism's naked buttocks, and walks out, followed almost immediately by Philip Chism. And he's carrying Colleen's pants. I would suggest to you can find he was carrying her underwear, intending to take them away with him to permanently deprive her of them, having stolen them from her when he had incapacitated her with the box cutter. And here's where he's supposed to be running around the school covered in blood, except he's only got blood on one hand. If he had inflicted wound D, why isn't there more blood on Philip Chism, except that right hand when he carries their items out of the school directly to a location where he knows there are shrubs next to the school building. Where Carolyn Quigley sees him in those shrubs, I would suggest to you hiding certain items, including the sweatshirt we know has blood on it. That blue sweatshirt. So he's not running around covered in blood, because he just hid those clothes. And he can't go in the way he came out, so he makes his way back into the main doorway. And where does he go from there? He goes down to the end of that hall on the first floor. Is he checking to make sure the recycling barrels are still there, available at the foot of stairwell 1? And he's not covered in blood because he just passed someone. And they didn't notice anything. And he goes into Colleen's classroom and he gets both of their things, removing, as Dr. Kinshirf told you, any sign that either of them is still in the building, And he makes his way down that hallway, but he only goes down the stairs because he's not seen again by a camera on the first floor. Is he secreting both of their things in the recycling barrels under that stairwell where he wouldn't be caught to trigger a camera. And he comes back upstairs. And I would suggest to you he is making his way back towards the girls' room to check on Colleen, to finish what he started. Who knows, to find what he lost, except he never makes it to the girls' room because there's Ramsey. And now he's got to get Ramsey away from that girls' room. Now he's got to get Ramsey as far from the girls' room as he can, down the hall, now holding the mask in his hand, not wearing it in front of Ramsey, as Ramsey's trying to figure out what's going on. Can Ramsey help him? Well, there's no way for Ramsey to help him without revealing what he's done. And there's Ramsey in the hall, but he told you he was just trying to figure out what was going on. Ladies and gentlemen, why does Ramsey matter? Not just because the defendant's exchange with him is clearly not openly psychotic. Yes, he's nervous. Yes, he's scared. He's in the middle of brutalizing and raping a teacher and someone just came looking for him. So let me suggest to you that being nervous and scared is not irrational. As he makes his way downstairs to get that recycling barrel. But what else is important about his encounter with Ramsey? Ramsey encounters him on the second floor landing outside the bathroom. Ramsey wasn't going to go into the second floor girls' room. There's no reason for Philip Chism to be concerned that Ramsey is going to go into the second floor girls' room. So why the urgency to get Ramsey away from that bathroom? Because only Philip Chism knew at that moment what injuries he had or hadn't inflicted to Colleen Ritzer. And only Philip Chism knew how badly injured she was in that bathroom. And only Philip Chism can be worried that Colleen Ritzer is capable of crying out or crawling out of that bathroom and getting the attention of Ramsey Escarcia. He wasn't going in the bathroom. So why the urgency to direct Ramsey away from that bathroom as quickly as possible unless Colleen still had life in her, unless wound D had not been inflicted? You will have a chance to look at the autopsy photo and you will see the injuries that surround wound D. They're not disorganized. They're not chaotic. And from the outside, they give you no information about how much damage they had done inside, as Dr. McDonald told you. He doesn't think he's killed her yet, and let me suggest to you, he hadn't. Yes, she is lying on that floor. The blood from those injuries is leaking in her body and then out of her body. It is gathering on the floor where eventually Vinicio Pimentel will find it. But the evidence in the woods, the evidence of the defendant's state of mind tells you that wound D has not yet been inflicted. And Dr. McDonald told you about how long she could have lived with just those other injuries. So he gets the recycling barrel, because that's the one way to get Colleen Ritzer out of that school undetected and into the woods to finish what he started. And he makes his way purposefully back to the girls' room, and he spends another 6 minutes in the girls' room getting Colleen into that barrel. And what did that do to the blood on the floor? How did that disperse the blood on the floor? You'll see there are drag marks of blood on her legs. Does that account for some of what Vinicio Pimentel saw? It's been 9 minutes since Danielle Bedard entered the bathroom until Philip Chism enters with the barrel. Only 9 minutes, not an hour and a half. 9 minutes that she's lying there bleeding from her injuries. And now the barrel is clearly heavier. And you heard from Dr. Kincher his opinion about when Philip Chism wears the ski mask and when he doesn't. But let me suggest to you something else. He's a teenager, and it's Danvers High School in the middle of the day. No one's first thought is, I bet he's wearing a ski mask and carrying a recycling barrel because he's murdered a teacher and he's moving her out of the school. You look at funny, weird things a teenager's wearing and you think, is that the latest style? You don't think, I bet he murdered a teacher. He had the advantage of time and place. As he moves Colleen directly out of the school building, down the sidewalk, past a man who's too busy with his phone to even look up, and he makes his way back behind the field house where Emily Roach will see him. Emily Roach, who didn't think anything of it because she thought it was a custodian moving fall waste. And he tries to access the woods in that far more remote location. That's where the track team practices, ladies and gentlemen. That's where the cross-country team was running. Emily told you that. But he thinks better of it. He can't get the barrel up there. So he eventually turns around and comes back. And he enters the woods across from the school. You saw the aerial photographs, ladies and gentlemen, what the foliage was like in October of 2013. And I would suggest to you he was pretty protected in those woods. It's been 25 minutes since he left the bathroom the first time. And he will spend 25 minutes in the woods with Colleen. 25 minutes where he isn't interrupted. 25 minutes to finish what he started. 25 minutes to rape her with that tree branch. And let's be clear, it's not a stick. It's a branch. And the entire tip of it is stained with Colleen Ritzer's blood. And he used that branch to tear at her vaginal tissue. The red blood cells that were intact, according to Dr. McDonald. She was very frank with you. She can't say pre-mortem. She can't say post-mortem. She calls it peri-mortem. Between life and death, when he raped her with that branch. He posed her. He painted that picture. And ladies and gentlemen, let me suggest to you, that is when he inflicted wound D. You heard from Dr. McDonald that wound D isn't really one wound. That wound D is a series of cuts that she called one wound. And we know he made them with this. You'll have it with you in the deliberation room. It's plastic, flimsy. The blade's an inch at the highest point. How many cuts did it take to inflict wound D? He severed her carotid. He sawed through her trachea, through her esophagus. He nicked her vertebra at the back of her neck. Ladies and gentlemen, if she had those injuries in the barrel, why isn't there any blood down the front of her? And no, there's not an enormous amount of blood in the woods, but should there be? She's already dying, we know that. She's lying on her back, and he's carving away at her neck. What was he trying to do? Was he trying to paint an even more terrible picture for those troopers to find the next day? How much more did he do than was even necessary to kill Colleen Ritzer? How much did it take? Concentrated, purposeful effort to use this to do to her what you will see in those autopsy photos, in that crime scene photo from the woods. He had 25 minutes to do that and to cover her with leaves framed by that fence. And yes, when he emerges from the woods, he is covered in blood all down the front of his jeans. Not like when he left the bathroom, His jeans are saturated. His socks are so saturated they've dried hard. The sneakers, which you saw no blood on when he left the bathroom, they're left in the woods covered in blood after those 25 minutes in the woods, not after the time in the bathroom. And he makes his way towards the doorway that is closest to his locker, but then reroutes back towards the academic wing. Was he going to get the things that he left in the shrubs that Carolyn Quigley saw him leave? And he goes directly up to the 3rd floor. He goes to his locker on the 3rd floor. He gets his soccer clothes. He doesn't see anybody. It's after school. People aren't in the academic wing. They're in the field house and the other parts of the school. When he goes to his locker, he gets that backpack he didn't need before, and he goes directly to the closest boys' room, and he changes out of those bloody clothes in the most direct way possible. He's not running all around the school covered in blood. He comes out of the woods, and he emerges in his soccer clothes. He makes his way downstairs, carrying his bloody clothing, fixing his glasses. And yeah, he goes back to the 2nd floor girls' room. Is he checking to see if anyone's discovered her? Is he checking to make sure he didn't drop anything? There's a lot of explanations for why he would double check that girls' room that make a lot of sense, ladies and gentlemen. I would suggest to you he's holding things differently when he exits the girls' room. Did he pick something else up? Did he do something in there? He makes his way out of Danvers High School and back ultimately to the woods. He spends about another 12 minutes in the woods, putting all of the different items and the locations where they will be found. And I would suggest you going through his things and Colleen's and taking what he wanted. Her wallet, her credit cards, some of the things from his school bag, others not. Is he writing that note when he's in the woods with the blue pen that will be found on him in Topsfield? He's doing what he wants for another 12 minutes in the woods, and then he emerges. He puts his shoes on in the shrubs. And yes, now he makes his way to the part of the school where people will be, because he's not covered in blood. He looks like any other kid at soccer practice time. And he runs into Kevin Hebert, who did make a connection with him, who did reach out to him, who did support him when he moved to Danvers. But that wasn't important to Dr. Dudley. And they have what Kevin described to you, I would suggest, is a perfectly normal conversation. They make plans for the weekend. He explains that he hasn't been getting Kevin's text because he's out of minutes. Does he look to you like he's staring off into space or mumbling, or is he having a conversation you wouldn't think twice of that Kevin Hebert didn't think twice about? And then yes, he makes his way through the school in the areas where people will see him first. And his biggest concern, ladies and gentlemen, is that the drawstrings on his backpack are tangled as he makes his way through the school. He makes his way back into the academic wing. And you'll see him digging into his bag, looking for something. Something he needs, something he wants. Something I would suggest to you he's chewing on when he's walking across the 3rd floor. He needed a snack after all of the activities of that afternoon. And then he leaves Danvers High School. And where does he go from there? We know the first place he goes is BJ's. Ladies and gentlemen, are his activities on Endicott Street consistent with psychosis or consistent with Philip Chism doing and getting what Philip Chism wants? He goes to BJ's, and you saw the video from BJ's and heard from the manager. He wants a knife at BJ's. Well, he can't buy a knife at BJ's because when you look through Colleen Ritzer's cards, you'll see she didn't have a BJ's card. So he can't use her credit card at BJ's. So he skillfully navigates the security system at BJ's, and you saw him on the video. You'll have a chance to see him again, sipping a sports drink, making his way through BJ's. And then what does he do? He goes to the movies. You heard what the financial circumstances were like for the Chisms, that there wasn't a lot of spare money around, that things were tight. So now you have a kid with a credit card. Ladies and gentlemen, if using a stolen credit card is evidence of psychosis or disorganization, then that's a bigger problem. You steal credit cards to use them. That's not mental illness. And ladies and gentlemen, let's be clear, he didn't have a good plan for getting away with this. He's 14 years old. We agree with that. Not a lot of long-term thinking, and he had accomplished already the one thing he really wanted to accomplish in those woods. And he makes his way to Endicott Street. Up Endicott, eventually to Route 1, where he's stopped by the Topsfield police. And then, in direct contradiction to every single image you have seen of him all day, he's acting crazy when he's stopped by the police. He's staring into the distance. He's not answering questions. He's faking bad the first time he's encountered by the police, because that was as close to a plan as he had. Ladies and gentlemen, the witnesses speak for themselves, and you can make your own judgments of the credibility and thoroughness of the psychiatric and psychological witnesses in this case. But what's the importance of malingering? What's the importance of Dr. Heaven's testing? She didn't go in looking for malingering. The tests she gave for mental illness, she couldn't trust because they triggered so high from malingering. She was stuck with those results, and those tests that are good enough for everyone else were apparently not good enough for Philip Chism, because be clear, the 2 tests she did for mental illness were meant for juveniles. They were intended for juveniles. But having gotten the test for malingering, she gave him the benefit of the doubt by doing further testing. She didn't skew her results. She lived with her results. They said what they said, and Dr. Kinshirf took them into account along with everything else. Unlike Dr. Dudley, who just ignored malingering, even though his entire opinion relied on the credibility of Philip Chism. Isn't it important to know if he's exaggerating? If you are going to rest your entire opinion on Philip Chism. But he didn't even take it into account. And neither did Dr. Jackson, and in all fairness to Dr. Jackson, he's not evaluating the defendant for criminal responsibility. He's trying to treat him for 20 days. He's trying to take care of him. And I would suggest to you, he agreed the test showed malingering, but it wasn't his job. Isn't that what he said? It wasn't his job to consider malingering. The one person whose job it was didn't do it, and that's Dr. Dudley. Ladies and gentlemen, the judge has repeatedly warned you to guard yourself against sympathy and prejudice in this case. And I certainly join in those warnings, as Ms. Regan did. And I think we all pretty easily understand what sympathy is, maybe more so in a case like this. And we think we understand prejudice, the us's and them's, the thoughts that we have that we guard ourselves against, or at least try not to say out loud. But let me suggest to you that there is a different kind of prejudice, one far more appealing, and one that we hold a lot closer to our hearts. And that's our view of the world, our hope, the idea that things are predictable, that we know what's going to happen, that things are expected. There is not one single person in this courtroom who wants to believe that a 14-year-old boy could have done this and not be crazy. But doing something so awful does not make you crazy. Dr. Kinshirf did look for an explanation, and he found one, and he told you about it in great detail. Ladies and gentlemen, let me respectfully suggest to you that Philip Chism is no more entitled to your prejudice of hope than either side is entitled to any other sympathy and prejudice in this case. I am not going to stand here and tell you there is nothing wrong with Philip Chism. How could I? But I am going to submit that there is overwhelming evidence in this case beyond any reasonable doubt that Philip Chism was not suffering from a mental disease or defect on October 22nd of 2013. That Philip Chism knew right from wrong and could choose right from wrong. He did it repeatedly over the course of that afternoon. He just didn't do it when it mattered. He had a goal, a terrible, terrible purpose, and he played it out in the woods, and he didn't care what came after that. Was he distancing himself from friends and not trying in school? Who cares about your friends? Who cares about your math grade when you know what you're going to do? He drew that picture in his head, and he drew it in those woods with Colleen. Ladies and gentlemen, I have asked you to consider the image of Colleen in the woods, and I will ask you in your deliberations to examine those autopsy photographs for what they tell you about the injuries in this case. But then I would ask you to return to this image of Colleen Ritzer. This was Colleen Ritzer. This is Colleen Ritzer. This is the Colleen Ritzer who was alone in that bathroom and in those woods with Philip Chism, not a mentally ill child, not someone powerless to voices in his head. The only person powerless in those bathroom, in those woods, is Colleen Ritzer, because she was alone with the person who robbed her of her underwear, who raped her again with a tree branch, and who murdered her with deliberate premeditation and with extreme atrocity and cruelty. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Lowy mentioned to many of you at the beginning of this process that the word verdict comes from the Latin, and it means to speak the truth. The truth born of evidence. The truth born of fact. I ask that you go back to the deliberation room, that you carefully examine all of the evidence in this case, and that you return to this courtroom and that you render your verdict. That you find the defendant guilty for the intentional and purposeful and knowing robbery, rapes, and murder of Colleen Ritzer. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do is in about 2 or 3 minutes, I'll see counsel at the sidebar. In about 2 or 3 minutes, we're going to take a recess for about 10 or 15 minutes so that you can be comfortable before the final instructions in this case. I just need to talk to the lawyers for a moment at the sidebar. In just a minute. There's nothing for you to talk about. As a matter of fact, it's going to take me about, I'd say at least an hour and 15 minutes, probably longer than that, to teach you the law that applies to this case. You'll ultimately find the facts from the evidence and follow the law as I instruct you, applying the facts as you find to the law in order to return a verdict. I remind you, as I did before the closings, that the closings are not evidence in the case. It's the opportunity of the attorneys to argue to you from the evidence. It's your collective memory of the evidence and your collective memory of the evidence alone that controls, and that you just do not decide this case based on pity, sympathy, fear, or favor for or against either side. All right, what we'll do is we'll take a recess, and if everybody's ready in 20 minutes, we'll have you come in 20 minutes for the final instructions. If you're not ready, let the court officer know that you need more time.
All rise.
Ladies and gentlemen, any of you have any difficulty following the instructions of the court not to discuss the case among yourselves or with anybody else during the recess? None of the jurors have answered affirmatively. So shortly you're going to begin your final duty, which is to decide the facts of this case from the evidence. Before you do, it's my responsibility to teach you all the law that applies to this case. The instructions are broken up into 3 parts, and I'll provide a recording of the entire instructions. The first part of the instructions will sound similar to those instructions I gave you quite a while ago now, those preliminary instructions. I'll just give you those instructions in much more detail. The second portion of the instructions will involve criminal responsibility, concepts of diminished capacity, the elements of the 2 indictments as it relates to aggravated rape, and 1 indictment for armed robbery. When I get to that portion of the instructions, I'm going to actually hand out instructions for you, so you'll have the recording, but you'll actually have them to read along as I instruct you. I think that'll make it easier for you to absorb the instructions. The third part of the instructions involve me selecting one of you as a foreperson of the jury, and then randomly reducing the jury to 12. Certain of you will become alternate jurors randomly, and I'll talk about that when we get to it. But the first matter I want to address is you and the way you've conducted yourself during this trial. And it has truly been extraordinary, the seriousness with which each of you has taken the awesome responsibility that you now have. The way you leaned into the evidence and listened to the evidence with the best that you could be. And everybody involved couldn't ask for more than the conscientiousness that you've brought to this responsibility that you now have. And I know you'll give me the same close attention as I teach you the law, and you'll continue to conduct yourself in jury deliberations according to the law as I instruct you. Which gets to the next point I wish to make, which is I will teach you the law that applies to the case. You must accept that law as I instruct you, whether you agree with that law or not. It's not for you to decide whether you think the law is wise or not wise, that it makes sense to you or doesn't make sense to you. You must accept the law as I instruct you, whether you agree with that law or not. Now, my responsibility during the trial has been to make sure that the trial proceeds in a fair, orderly, and efficient manner, to rule on issues of law, to rule on issues of evidence, and to teach you the law that applies to the case. It's my responsibility and my responsibility alone, should the Commonwealth prove 1 or more of the indictments beyond a reasonable doubt, to sentence the defendant. And you may not consider any sentencing consequences in your deliberations, since that has nothing to do with your role as the only judges of the facts of the case. I hope it's obvious to you throughout the trial that you should never consider, or any perception you might have about what I think you should do as far as deciding the facts of the case. Should you perceive I have a view of what your verdict should be, I'll tell you right now that I don't, and I'll tell you why in a moment. But to the extent you misperceive that I do, I instruct you to disregard it. When I'm listening to the witnesses on the witness stand, when I'm talking to the lawyers at the sidebar, it just never occurs to me to consider anything about the credibility of the witnesses. It would never occur to me to think of the evidence in those terms, the way the jury does. I'm busy doing my job to the best of my ability every day, and I just simply don't have a view of your verdict because I don't listen to the evidence in a way that would allow me to do so. I listen to every answer and review every exhibit as a judge of the law. Now, the attorneys, they have a grave responsibility during this trial. They have a very serious responsibility to zealously represent their respective clients. And sometimes they've asked to speak to me over here at the sidebar at the judge's bench, and more often it's been that you've been out of the courtroom for a period of time, sometimes for a long period of time while we were discussing issues of law. And members of the jury, that wasn't to keep important information away from you. It was so that I can make sure that the evidence was presented in a fair manner, in a manner that gave you a fair opportunity to evaluate its worth. You may remember I said at the beginning of the trial that if the sidebars went too long at any point in time, or you were out of the courtroom at any point in time, you are always welcome, and you still are, to be frustrated with me and hold it against me. Feel free. Just never hold it against the lawyers because they're performing their responsibility as advocates for their clients. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you might not have realized the full weight of what I'm going to say right now until this very moment. But you have the most important role in the trial. You have the most important responsibility in the trial. This case is not tried to me, it's tried to you. You are the sole and exclusive judges of the facts of this case. You alone determine what evidence to accept, how important the evidence is that you do accept, and what conclusions you should draw from the evidence. You must be completely fair and completely impartial. You may not be swayed by any biases or prejudices or personal likes or dislikes to either side, or because the charge is either popular or unpopular with the public. You can't decide the case based on emotion, based on sympathy. It's understandable to feel emotion for everybody involved in this case, but this case is not about emotion. It's about you carefully, assiduously, conscientiously reviewing the evidence, finding the facts from that evidence, and apply those facts to the law as I instruct you. You are not to decide this case based on anything you may have seen or heard outside of this courtroom, and you're not to engage in guesswork or engage in speculation. In short, you should confine your deliberations to the evidence, find the facts from that evidence, and apply those facts to the law as I teach you the law. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk a little bit about what is evidence in the case and what is not evidence in the case. These instructions are not evidence in the case. The closing arguments that you just heard, that's not evidence in the case. That was an opportunity for the lawyers to suggest to you what conclusions you should draw from the evidence. I remind you, as I have many times, it's your collective memory of the evidence and your collective memory of the evidence that controls. And those opening statements, those many days ago, were not evidence in the case. That was to give you an overview of what the lawyers expected the evidence would be so you could have a context as you listen to the evidence. Now, if at any point in time the lawyers reference the evidence or I reference the evidence, and your collective memory of the evidence is different, it is your collective memory of the evidence and your collective memory of the evidence alone that controls. It is your memory of the evidence alone that controls. Now, some of you took notes during the trial. Some of you took notes more than others. My suggestion was that you take notes sparingly. I certainly spent a lot of time during the trial, you probably noticed, going up and down the jury box, just making sure everything's okay, and I didn't see anybody who missed a trial with his or her nose in the notebook. But just keep in mind that the notes are not your memory, they're merely an aid to your memory, and don't use your notes to convince your fellow jurors of what the facts are. Now, what type of evidence do we have in the trial? Well, we have the testimony of the witnesses, their answers to questions. The Latin is viva voce evidence, the spoken word. Their spoken word to you is evidence in the case. Now, if a question was asked and I sustained an objection and you got no answer, questions are never evidence in the case. They're never evidence in the case. If I overruled an objection or rejected an objection, you have that answer before you. That's spoken word of witnesses to you. That's viva voce evidence, the spoken word. And when I overrule or reject an objection, I am not making any comment at all about what the weight or value of that evidence is. It would never occur to me to do so. I'm simply determining that it is an answer that you may consider along with every other answer in the case. Now, there's exhibits in the case, 140 of those exhibits indeed. And it's going to take a while after I finish my instructions to get all those exhibits with you in the jury room, but you'll have all those exhibits with you in the jury room when you deliberate in the case. The court took judicial notice of certain facts as true, and you have that evidence before you as well. When the court takes judicial notice, it's simply a shortcut to evidence, and you undoubtedly recall that evidence as it related to a couple of issues. There were also a number of stipulations or agreements between the parties. If it was agreement as to fact, you must accept it. If it was an agreement as to what testimony would be, you may accept it. Consider all the evidence as a whole, and keep an open mind. I'll talk about this more when you get in right before I talk to the lawyers after the instructions. But keep an open mind. Consider all the evidence as a whole, and listen carefully and seriously to your fellow jurors, and share your own thoughts fully as well. Now, the indictments against Mr. Chism are only an accusation. They're not evidence. And the defendant has denied that he's guilty of the crimes charged in these indictments. The law presumes the defendant to be innocent of the charges against him. This presumption of innocence is a rule of law that compels you to find the defendant not guilty unless and until the Commonwealth produces evidence from whatever source that proves the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. This burden of proof never shifts. The defendant is not required to call any witnesses or produce any evidence since he is presumed to be innocent. The presumption of innocence stays with the defendant unless and until the evidence convinces you unanimously as a jury that the defendant is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. It requires you to find the defendant not guilty unless his guilt has been proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt. As I will mention numerous times when we go over the indictments, your verdict as to each indictment, whether it is guilty or not guilty, must be unanimous. All 12 sitting jurors must agree on your verdict. Or what is proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, the term is often used and probably pretty well understood, although it is not easily defined. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean proof beyond all possible doubt, for everything in the lives of human beings is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. A charge is proved beyond a reasonable doubt if after you have compared and considered all the evidence, you have in your minds an abiding conviction to a moral certainty that the charge is true. When we refer to moral certainty, we mean the highest degree of certainty possible in matters relating to human affairs, based solely on the evidence that has been put before you in this case. I have told you that every person is presumed innocent until he is proved guilty, and the burden of proof is on the prosecutor. If you evaluate all the evidence and you still have a reasonable doubt remaining, the defendant is entitled to the benefit of that doubt and must be acquitted. It is not enough for the Commonwealth to establish a probability, even a strong probability, that the defendant is more likely guilty than not guilty. That is not enough. Instead, the evidence must convince you of the defendant's guilt to a reasonable and moral certainty, a certainty that convinces your understanding and satisfies your reason and judgment as jurors who are sworn to act conscientiously on the evidence. That is what we mean by proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we have two types of evidence in a criminal trial. We have direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. You have a direct evidence when the witness from the witness stand testifies to you something that witness observed with his or her own senses, something the witness saw, tasted, heard, or smelled. In that situation, the only issue for you is whether or not you believe that particular witness's version of events. Now, you have circumstantial evidence when a witness can't testify to you directly about a fact to be proved, but you're presented with other evidence. And from that other evidence, you find facts, and then you draw reasonable inferences from them about the facts which have been proved to you. And the law allows either type of proof in a criminal trial. I'll give you an example of this. Let's say that you go home today, and when you get home, your next door neighbor says, well, I was over at your mailbox checking your mail for you like you asked me to. I went there at 10 o'clock. There was no mail in the mailbox. I went back at noon, and there was some mail in the mailbox. Well, you can draw an inference or a conclusion that sometime between 10 and noon, the letter carrier arrived and dropped mail in the mailbox. On the other hand, if your neighbor's looking out the window and says to you, well, I saw the letter carrier arrive at 11:28, you have direct evidence of what the letter carrier, when the letter carrier arrived. And the law allows either type of proof in a criminal trial. Two things to keep in mind about circumstantial evidence. The first one is this: you may only draw inferences and conclusions from facts that have been proven to you. And the second point is this: your inferences and conclusions, they need not be inevitable, but they need to be reasonable, they need to be consistent with each other, and together they must establish the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. So all an inference really is a permissible deduction that you make from evidence that you have accepted as believable. And we do these things in our everyday life. They're just small steps in reasoning where you take some known information and apply your life experience and common sense in order to draw a conclusion. And I think I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about the role of the jury and your ability to utilize your common sense and your life experience. All of you came to jury duty and have now with you common sense and life experience. And really, that common sense and that life experience is the great contribution that you all have to make to our system of justice. And when you're examining the exhibits, when you're listening to the witnesses on the witness stand, when you're deciding the credibility, the believability of the witnesses, as the only judges of the facts of the case, you obviously want to bring to bear that common sense and that experience in life. Because it will be your duty, and your duty alone, to determine any disputed questions of fact. You will have to determine which witnesses to believe and how much weight or belief to give each witness's testimony. You should give each witness's testimony whatever degree of belief and importance you believe it is fairly entitled to receive. You have great power in this regard. You can believe everything a witness says, you can believe nothing a witness says, or anywhere in between. Ultimately, it's up to you to resolve any conflicts in the testimony and decide where the truth lies. If you do not believe a witness's testimony that something happened, of course your disbelief is not evidence that it did not happen. When you disbelieve a witness, it just means that you have to look elsewhere for credible evidence about that issue. Now, in deciding whether or not to believe a witness or how much weight or value or importance to give a witness's testimony, again, you apply your own common sense and life experience. Often, it's not just what a witness says, but how a witness says it. It may give you some clue or some insight into whether or not to credit a witness's version of events. You can consider a witness's frankness or lack of frankness when testifying, whether the witness's memory seems to be accurate or not accurate. You can take into account how good an opportunity the witness had to observe the facts to which the witness is testifying, whether the witness's memory seems to you to be accurate or not accurate. You can consider the age and intelligence of a witness testifying before you. And you can consider whether a witness has any interest in the outcome of a case. Now, the fact that a witness has an interest in the outcome of a case doesn't mean that witness isn't trying to tell you the truth as that witness believes it to be, but a witness's interest in the outcome of a case is a factor that you may consider along with all the other factors in determining the credibility of witnesses. Where there are inconsistencies or discrepancies in a witness's testimony, or between the testimony of different witnesses, that may or may not cause you to discredit such testimony. Innocent mistakes of memory do happen. Sometimes people forget things or remember things differently. In weighing such discrepancies, you should consider whether they involve important matters of fact or minor details, and whether the discrepancies result from innocent lapses of memory or intentional falsehood. When you evaluate the testimony that a witness gave here in court, you may consider whether the witness made an earlier statement that differs from or contradicts in any way his or her in-court testimony. An omission from an earlier statement is inconsistent with a later statement of fact when it would have been natural to include the fact in the initial statement. If you determine that an earlier statement is different from the way the witness testified in court, you may decide that the witness's credibility or believability is affected adversely, or you may decide that it is not affected adversely. Now, I'm going to give you an instruction concerning expert witnesses, and I'm going to actually read you the instruction because it's an instruction that we've received from our Supreme Judicial Court when there's expert witnesses. In any case where there's expert witnesses. There's one more point about witnesses to address, expert witnesses. This term refers to witnesses who have specialized training or experience in a particular field. Generally, in cases that are tried in our courts, both civil and criminal, witnesses may testify only to facts that are within their own personal knowledge, things that they have seen, heard, smelled, felt, or tasted. However, in a variety of cases, issues arise that are beyond the experience of lay witnesses. And in those type of cases, we allow a person with specialized training or experience, called an expert witness, to testify. And to testify not only to facts, but also to opinions, and the reasons for his or her opinion on issues that are within the witness's field of expertise and are relevant and material to the case. Because a particular witness has specialized training and experience in his or her field does not put that witness on a higher level than any other witness. You are to treat so-called expert witnesses just like you would treat any other witness. In other words, as with any other witness, it is completely up to you to decide whether you accept the testimony of an expert witness, including the opinions that the witness gave. It is also entirely up to you to decide whether you accept the facts relied on by the expert and to decide what conclusions, if any, you draw from the expert's testimony. You are free to reject the testimony and opinion of such a witness in whole or in part if you determine that the witness's opinion is not based on sufficient education, experience, or the testimony of the witness was motivated by some bias or interest in the case. You must also, as has been explained to you before, keep firmly in mind that you alone decide what the facts are. If you conclude that an expert's opinion is not based on the facts, as you find those facts to be, then you may reject the testimony or the opinion of the expert in whole or in part. You must remember, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that expert witnesses do not decide cases. Juries do. In the last analysis, an expert witness is like any other witness in the sense that you alone make a judgment about how much credibility and weight you give the expert's testimony and what conclusions you draw from that testimony. You notice that the defendant, Mr. Chism, did not testify at this trial. The defendant has an absolute right not to testify, since the entire burden of proof in this case is on the Commonwealth to prove the defendant guilty. It is not up to the defendant to prove that he is innocent. Under our system of law, a defendant has a perfect right to say to the Commonwealth, you have the burden of proving your case against me beyond a reasonable doubt. I do not have to say a word. The fact that the defendant did not testify has nothing to do with the question of whether he is guilty or not guilty. You are not to draw any adverse inference against the defendant because he did not testify. You are not to consider it any way or even discuss it in your deliberations. You must determine whether the Commonwealth has proved its case against the defendant based solely on the testimony of the witnesses, the exhibits, the stipulations, and judicial notice. Sometimes evidence such as photographs were presented to you as jurors, and you'll have those photographs and exhibits with you in the jury room, and they may elicit an emotional response. It is natural and understandable to feel sympathy and empathy when you hear about a person who has been injured in a serious way or suffered in some way. But as jurors, you have sworn to take an oath to follow the law. I instruct you that the law says you must separate any emotional reaction on your part from the informational value and weight of the evidence. You are not to be influenced in any way by the unpleasant nature of some photographs. You must find the facts in this case based solely on the evidence. Evidence that a person has suffered harm or has been injured, and photographs depicting the alleged victim's medical condition may be relevant to fact questions that you have to decide as to the nature and extent of Ms. Ritzer's injuries as it relates to the state of mind of the defendant. But you can't find facts or base your decision on sympathy, anger, passion, or prejudice, pity for or against either side. Rather, your verdict must be based solely on the evidence in this case and these instructions of law. Which brings me to another point I'd like to mention, which is sometimes evidence was admitted for a limited purpose. When I admit evidence for a limited purpose, you may only consider evidence for the purpose for which it's been admitted and for no other purpose. The other thing I want to mention to you is that if an answer was given and I struck the answer from the record, that answer that was struck from the record is not evidence in the case. Now, you've heard testimony about a statement the defendant allegedly made to the Topsfield police concerning the offenses which are charged in this case. Before you can consider such a statement made by the defendant, you are going to have to make a preliminary determination whether it can be considered as evidence or not. You may not consider any such statement in your deliberations unless from all the evidence in the case the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant made the statement that he's alleged to have made and that he made it voluntarily, freely, and rationally. In your deliberations, you may not consider any statement that the defendant made about the offense unless the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt both that the defendant made the statement and that he made it voluntarily, freely, and rationally. If the Commonwealth has met that burden, then you may consider the defendant's statement to the Topsfield police and rely on it as much or as little as you think proper, along with all the other evidence. In determining whether or not any statement made by the defendant was voluntary, you may consider all the surrounding circumstances. You can take into account the nature of any conversation that the police officers had with the defendant and the duration of any questioning, if there was any. You may consider whether the statement was made and when it was made. You may consider the defendant's physical and mental condition, his intelligence, age, education, experience, and personality. Your decision does not turn on any one factor. You must consider the totality of the surrounding circumstances. Certain records were admitted in the case. We sometimes refer to them as business records. For instance, by way of example, the Chase records. Before you may even consider a document as evidence that would be a business record, you must be satisfied, more likely than not, that the document was made in good faith, that it was made in the regular course of business, it was the regular course of business to make such a record, that the document was made before the beginning of the proceedings, and that the document was made at a time of the act or event in question or within a reasonable time thereafter. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do is pass out instructions to you, and you might find this is a good time to stretch while we pass those out to you. Caitlin, can you do me a favor, flip it and rewind? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm now going to instruct you on criminal responsibility. To prove the defendant guilty of any crime, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was criminally responsible at the time of the alleged crime, was committed. The burden is not on the defendant to prove a lack of criminal responsibility. Under the law, the Commonwealth bears the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the crimes with which he is charged, and also that the defendant is criminally responsible for his conduct. Criminal responsibility is a legal term. A person is not criminally responsible for his conduct if he has a mental disease or defect, and as a result of that mental disease or defect, lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality or wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. The phrase mental disease or defect is a legal term, not a medical term. It need not fit into a formal diagnosis. The phrase mental disease or defect does not include an abnormality manifested only by repeated criminal or otherwise antisocial conduct. It is for you to determine, in light of all the evidence, whether the defendant had a mental disease or defect. If the Commonwealth has proved to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was not suffering from a mental disease or defect at the time of the killing, the Commonwealth has satisfied its burden of proving that the defendant was criminally responsible. If you have a reasonable doubt whether the defendant had a mental disease or defect at the time of the killing, then you must determine whether, as a result of a mental disease or defect, he lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the criminality or wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. To establish that the defendant had substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that any mental disease or defect that may have existed did not deprive the defendant of his ability to behave as the law requires, that is, to obey the law. The word appreciate means to understand rather than merely to know. Criminality means legal significance of conduct. Wrongfulness means moral significance. The Commonwealth must prove that the defendant knew and understood that his conduct was illegal or that it was wrong. It is not enough for the Commonwealth to show that the defendant merely knew or was intellectually aware that his conduct was illegal or wrong. Rather, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a mental disease or defect did not deprive the defendant of a meaningful understanding of the legal or moral significance of his conduct. The defendant must have been able to realize in some meaningful way that his conduct was illegal or wrong. In considering whether the Commonwealth has met its burden of proof, you may consider all the evidence that has been presented to you during this trial. You may consider the facts underlying the crime and evidence of the defendant's actions before and after the crime. You may consider the opinions of any experts who testified and give those opinions whatever weight you think they deserve. In a moment, I will instruct you on the elements of the offenses that the Commonwealth alleges the defendant committed. Remember, the Commonwealth must prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was criminally responsible at the time the crime was committed. That is, that the defendant did not lack criminal responsibility at that time. Therefore, it is the Commonwealth's burden to prove at least one of the following beyond a reasonable doubt: that at the time of the alleged crime, the defendant did not suffer from a mental disease or defect, or two, that if the defendant did suffer from a mental disease or defect, he nonetheless retains substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness or criminality of his conduct and to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. As I have previously instructed, your decision should be based solely on the evidence and the law of this case without regard to the possible consequences of your verdict. You may not consider sentencing or punishment in reaching your verdicts. However, I'm going to tell you what happens to a defendant if he is found not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility. First, the court may order the defendant to be hospitalized at a mental health facility for a period of observation and examination. During this observation period, or in any event within 60 days after the verdict of not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility, the district attorney or other appropriate authorities may petition the court to commit the defendant to a mental health facility or Bridgewater State Hospital. If the Commonwealth concludes that the defendant is mentally ill and that his discharge would create a substantial likelihood of harm to himself or others, then the court will grant the petition and commit the defendant to a proper mental facility or Bridgewater State Hospital initially for a period of 6 months. At the end of 6 months and every year thereafter, the court reviews the order of commitment. If the defendant is still suffering from a mental disease or defect and is still dangerous, then the court will order the defendant to continue to be committed to the mental facility or the Bridgewater State Hospital. There is no limit to the number of such renewed orders or commitments as long as the defendant continues to be mentally ill and dangerous. If these conditions do continue, the defendant may remain committed for the duration of his life. If at some point the defendant is no longer mentally ill and dangerous, the court will order him discharged from the mental health facility or from Bridgewater State Hospital after a hearing. The district attorney must be notified of any hearing concerning whether the person may be released, and the district attorney, as I said, has a right to be heard. However, the final decision whether to recommit or release a defendant is always made by the court. This is what happens if you find the defendant not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility. Whenever the defendant's knowledge or intent must be proved, the defendant's culpability rests upon proof of such knowledge or intent. The Commonwealth must prove the requisite knowledge or intent beyond a reasonable doubt in order to prove that the defendant committed the crimes charged. Whenever the Commonwealth must prove the defendant's intention to do something, you should consider any credible evidence of mental impairment in determining whether the Commonwealth has met its burden of proof. Likewise, whenever the Commonwealth must prove the defendant's knowledge of any facts or circumstances, you should consider any credible evidence of mental impairment in determining whether the Commonwealth has met its burden of proof. More particularly, you may consider any credible evidence of the defendant's mental impairment in determining whether the defendant deliberately premeditated the killing of the deceased, that is, whether the defendant thought before he acted, and whether the defendant reached a decision to kill after reflection, at least for a short period of time, whether the defendant intended to kill or caused grievous bodily harm to the deceased, or was aware that his conduct created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result, whether the defendant acted in a cruel or atrocious manner in causing the death of the deceased, and whether the defendant had the requisite knowledge and intent as it relates to the youthful offender indictments of aggravated rape an armed robbery. I reiterate, whenever the Commonwealth must prove that the defendant intended to do something or had some knowledge of certain facts or circumstances in order to prove the crime, you may consider any credible evidence of mental impairment in determining whether the Commonwealth has met its burden of proving the defendant's intent or knowledge. Now I'm going to talk about the armed robbery indictment. In this case, the defendant, Philip Chism, is charged in a youthful offender indictment with the crime of armed robbery. Indictment 002 alleges that the defendant committed an armed robbery of Colleen Ritzer's underwear. In order to prove the defendant guilty of armed robbery, the Commonwealth must prove 4 elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First element, that the defendant was armed with a dangerous weapon. Second element, that the defendant applied actual force and violence to the body of the alleged victim for the purposes of obtaining the alleged victim's underwear. The third element, that the defendant took the underwear with the intent to steal it. And the fourth element, that the defendant took the underwear from the person or immediate control of the alleged victim. The first element the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that the defendant was armed with a dangerous weapon. Commonwealth must prove that the defendant consciously and purposefully had a dangerous weapon in his possession. The defendant must be armed at a point directly related to the commission and completion of the robbery. To be armed with a dangerous weapon means that the defendant had a dangerous weapon on his person, that he knew he had it on his person, and that he intended to have it on his person. A dangerous weapon is any instrument that by the nature of its construction or manner of use is capable of causing grievous bodily injury or death, or could be perceived by a reasonable person as capable of such injury. An item that is normally used for innocent purposes can become a dangerous weapon if it is intentionally used in a dangerous or potentially dangerous fashion. Therefore, you must determine whether the defendant used it as a weapon with the same intent to use it in a dangerous or potentially dangerous fashion. So there's a words right after that I don't know how it got there, sentence, which you should cross out. The law of armed robbery does not require the Commonwealth to show that the instrument was actually used. It is sufficient if the Commonwealth proves beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was actually armed with a dangerous weapon. The second element the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that the defendant applied actual force and violence to the body of the alleged victim. When actual force is used, it must be applied to or exerted on the body of the alleged victim. The degree of force used by the defendant does not matter so long as it is sufficient for the defendant to obtain the alleged victim's underwear against her will. The alleged victim must be aware of the application of such force. However, an opportunity to resist or actual resistance is not necessary on the part of the alleged victim. Where the Commonwealth proves that the defendant has exerted actual force and violence, no fear needs to be instilled in the alleged victim. The third element the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that the defendant took the underwear with the intent to steal it. This means the Commonwealth must prove that the defendant consciously and purposely intended to take and carry away Ms. Ritzer's underwear against her will with the intent to deprive her of the underwear permanently. Thus, the word intent refers to a person's objective or purpose. The defendant must have engaged in a conscious act with determination of mind to do the act, to take the underwear, and must have intended the consequences of the act, that Ms. Ritzer be permanently deprived of the underwear. The intent to steal must coincide with the force or threats against Ms. Ritzer. Therefore, it is not robbery if a person sets out to commit an assault and then as an afterthought commits a theft. In the same way, if a person has committed a theft that is over and done with and then afterwards displays force or threats, that is not robbery unless the thief has a continuing intent to steal. The fourth element the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that the defendant took the property from the possession or control of the alleged victim. The alleged victim need not have actual physical possession of the property. It is sufficient if the property is within the alleged victim's area of control. Property is considered under the control of the alleged victim when it is within her reach, inspection, observation, or control, so long as she can readily obtain possession of it, if not overcome by violence. The value or amount of the property does not matter, and the Commonwealth is not required to prove the property's value as alleged in the indictment, as long as the Commonwealth proves it has some value. In deciding whether the defendant had the necessary intent to commit an armed robbery of Ms. Ritzer, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant suffered from a mental impairment. The defendant may form the required intent and commit the act of armed robbery even if he suffered from a mental impairment, but you may consider such evidence in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved these elements. Therefore, after considering all the evidence, if you determine that the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt each of the four elements I have just defined, you would find the defendant guilty of armed robbery. However, if the Commonwealth has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt one or more of these elements, then you would consider the lesser included offense of larceny. Once again, if you find that the Commonwealth has failed to prove one or more of the elements of armed robbery beyond a reasonable doubt as to the underwear, then you would consider the lesser included offense of larceny. Larceny is the wrongful taking of the personal property of another with the intent to deprive such person of such property permanently. In order to prove the defendant guilty of larceny, the Commonwealth must prove three elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, the defendant took and carried away the property unlawfully. Secondly, the property was owned by someone other than the defendant. And third, that the defendant did so with the intent to deprive the person of the property permanently. I will explain these elements for you. The element of taking and carrying away is accomplished if the defendant unlawfully physically transfers the property from the other person's control or possession to his own possession or control. It does not matter if the transfer involves only slight movement or it lasts a short time. The term property includes, but is not limited to, items of personal property. The Commonwealth must prove that a person other than the defendant owned the property. The third element the Commonwealth must prove is that the defendant intended to deprive the owner of the property permanently. This may be proved by direct evidence or by inferences from the surrounding circumstances. For example, if a person takes property of another and disposes it with utter indifference to whether the owner recovers its possession, you may infer an intent to deprive the owner of it permanently. In deciding whether the defendant had the necessary intent to commit a larceny from the alleged victim, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant suffered from a mental impairment. A defendant may form the required intent and commit the act of larceny even if he suffered from mental impairment, but you may consider such evidence in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved these elements. Therefore, after considering all the evidence, if you determine that the Commonwealth has proved each of these three elements beyond a reasonable doubt, as I've defined these elements for you, your verdict, if you reach the lesser included offense of larceny, would be guilty. If, however, the Commonwealth has failed to prove one or more of these three elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you would find the defendant not guilty of larceny. The defendant, Philip Chism, is charged in a youthful offender indictment with having committed the crime of aggravated rape on Colleen Ritzer. Indictments 2014-109001 involves the allegation that the defendant put his penis in Ms. Ritzer's vagina. Indictment 2013-1447001, that should say 002, ladies and gentlemen. 002 involves the allegation that the defendant inserted a tree branch into Ms. Ritzer's vaginal opening in the woods outside Danvers High School. These are two separate indictments. You must therefore consider each indictment separately. Your verdict as to each aggravated indictment must be unanimous, whether it is guilty or not guilty. In order to prove the defendant guilty of aggravated rape, the Commonwealth must prove the following three elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant engaged in sexual intercourse, either natural or unnatural, with the alleged victim. Second, that the sexual intercourse was accomplished by compelling the alleged victim to submit by force or threat of bodily injury and against the alleged victim's will. And third, that the sexual intercourse resulted in or was committed with acts resulting in serious bodily injury or was committed during the commission of the crime of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. The first element the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that the defendant engaged in natural or unnatural sexual intercourse with Ms. Ritzer. Natural intercourse is normal intercourse. That That is, it consists of inserting the penis into the female sex organ. Unnatural sexual intercourse in the context of indictment 002 involves the allegation that the defendant inserted a tree branch into Ms. Ritzer's vaginal opening. Either natural or unnatural sexual intercourse is complete upon penetration, no matter how slight of a person's genital opening. In addition to the vagina, the female genital opening includes interior parts known as the vulva and labia. Penetration into the vagina itself is not required. The second element the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that the natural or unnatural sexual intercourse was accomplished by force or threat of bodily injury and against the alleged victim's will. The force needed for rape may, depending on the circumstances, be constructive force as physical force, violence, or threat of bodily harm. The Commonwealth must also prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant performed the sexual intercourse against the alleged victim's will. The Commonwealth must prove that at the time of penetration, the alleged victim did not consent. In other words, that the intercourse was against her will. If a person submits because of fear, it is not consent. The person must be free to exercise her will without restraint. You may consider evidence of the alleged victim's state of mind at the time of the alleged incident on the issue of consent. The alleged victim is not required to use physical force to resist. However, you may consider evidence of any attempt to restrain or confine the alleged victim, of violence by the defendant, or struggle or outcry by the alleged victim on the issue of force and consent. However, lack of such evidence does not necessarily imply consent or the absence of force, because in certain circumstances, physical resistance may not be possible. You may consider all the circumstances and the entire sequence of events in determining whether the intercourse was without Ms. Ritzer's consent and her ability to resist. In order to prove the second element as to each indictment, that is, for sexual intercourse against Ms. Ritzer's will, you must find one of the following. One, that Ms. Ritzer was alive at the time of penetration, or in the alternative, if you cannot determine that Ms. Ritzer was alive at the precise moment of penetration, that the killing and the alleged aggravated rape were part of one continuous event. The crime of rape requires penetration of a live human being. In the circumstances of one continuous event, it does not matter whether the alleged victim's death preceded or followed the sexual attack. For the alleged rape to constitute one continuous event, you must find beyond a reasonable doubt that the death and the alleged rape occur very close in time, almost simultaneously, and that the alleged rape must be inextricably intertwined with the event or events that caused the alleged victim's death. The Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the alleged rape and the cause of death were tied together by a unity of time, place, and circumstance. When I speak of one continuous event, you are to determine whether this requirement, as with all the elements of each indictment of aggravated rape, separately. You must be unanimous as to each indictment whether your verdict is guilty or not guilty. The third element the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt is that the sexual intercourse was committed with acts resulting in serious bodily injury or during the commission of the crime of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon. Let me define those terms. Serious bodily injury means bodily injury which results in permanent disfigurement, protracted loss or impairment of bodily function, or substantial risk of death. In order to prove that the defendant committed an assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, the Commonwealth must prove three things beyond a reasonable doubt. That the defendant touched the person of Ms. Ritzer, however slightly, without having any right or excuse to do so. That the defendant intended to touch Ms. Ritzer, and that he consciously and purposely intended the touching to occur, and that the touching was not negligent or merely accidental. And third, that the touching was done with a dangerous weapon. The alleged rape and the aggravating event, serious bodily injury or assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon, need not occur at precisely the same time. However, they must occur during the same criminal episode and constitute one continuous course of conduct. In order for the crime of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon to satisfy this element, you must also find the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the acts of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon allegedly committed on Ms. Ritzer went beyond those to facilitate the alleged rape. That is, if you find that the acts of assault and battery with a dangerous weapon were incidental to the alleged rape itself, you would find the Commonwealth has not satisfied the alleged rape occurred by assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon. In deciding whether the defendant had the necessary intent to commit aggravated rape upon the alleged victim, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant suffered from a mental impairment. The defendant may form the required intent and commit the act of aggravated rape even if he suffered from a mental impairment, but you may consider such evidence in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved these elements. Therefore, after considering all the evidence, if you determine that the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt each of these three elements, as I've defined them for you, looking at each indictment separately, then you would find the defendant guilty of aggravated rape. If, however, the Commonwealth has failed to prove one or more of the three elements beyond a reasonable doubt, as to each indictment, looking at each indictment separately, you would find the defendant not guilty of aggravated rape. If you conclude that the Commonwealth has proven the defendant guilty of the offenses contained in the indictments involving aggravated rape and armed robbery, after consideration of all the evidence, there are three other questions you must answer. Has the Commonwealth proven beyond a reasonable doubt that at the time of the offenses were committed that the defendant was between the ages of 14 and 18 years old? Has the Commonwealth proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the offenses were punishable by imprisonment in state prison if the defendant was an adult, i.e. a felony? And has the Commonwealth proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the offenses involve infliction of serious bodily injury in violation of the law? I have instructed you on the term serious bodily injury in my instruction on aggravated rape. You should use that definition here as it applies to both youthful offender indictments. I instruct you that aggravated rape and armed robbery are felonies. Now I'm going to instruct you on murder in the first degree. The defendant, Philip Chism, is charged in indictment 2013-01446001 with the murder of Colleen Ritzer. Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being. There are two different degrees of murder: murder in the first degree and murder in the second degree. The Commonwealth alleges that the defendant committed murder in the first degree on two following theories: murder with deliberate premeditation and murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty. You ought to consider each of these theories and may find the defendant not guilty or guilty of one or two of these theories. Your verdict must be unanimous, whether it is not guilty or guilty of one or more theories of murder. To find the defendant guilty of any of these theories of murder, meaning in this context, murder with deliberate premeditation or murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty, you must be unanimous. That is, all the deliberating jurors must agree that the Commonwealth has met its burden of proving every required element of that theory beyond a reasonable doubt. You should check the appropriate block or blocks on the verdict slip that I will pass out to you as to each theory on which you agree unanimously. I will begin instructing you on the elements and the additional requirements of proof as to each of these two theories of murder in the first degree. I will then instruct you on murder in the second degree. Murder with deliberate premeditation. I will define the elements of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. To prove the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation, the Commonwealth must prove beyond a reasonable doubt the following three elements. First, that the defendant caused the death of Ms. Ritzer. Secondly, that the defendant intended to kill Ms. Ritzer. That is, that the defendant consciously and purposely intended to cause Ms. Ritzer's death. And third, that the defendant committed the killing with deliberate premeditation. That is, he decided to kill after a period of reflection. I will now discuss each of these required elements in more detail. First element is that the defendant caused the death of Ms. Ritzer. The defendant's act is the cause of Ms. Ritzer's death, where the act in natural and continuous sequence results in death and without which death would not have occurred. The second element is that the defendant intended to kill Ms. Ritzer. That is, that the defendant consciously and purposely intended to cause Ms. Ritzer's death. The third element is that the defendant committed the killing with deliberate premeditation. That is, he decided to kill after a period of reflection. Deliberate premeditation does not require any particular length of time of reflection. The decision to kill may be formed over a period of days, hours, or even a few seconds. The key is the sequence of the thought process. First, the consideration of whether to kill. Second, the decision to kill. And third, the killing arising from the decision. There is no deliberate premeditation where the action is taken so quickly that a defendant takes no time to reflect on the action and then decides to do it. In deciding whether the defendant intended to kill Ms. Ritzer and whether he formed that intent with deliberate premeditation, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant suffered from a mental impairment. The defendant may form the required intent and act with deliberate premeditation even if he suffered from a mental impairment, but you may consider such evidence in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved these elements. After considering all the evidence in this case, you find the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt each of the three elements I have just defined, then you would find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. If, however, after your consideration of all the evidence, you find the Commonwealth has not proved one or more of those elements, three elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you would find the defendant not guilty of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. Now, a second theory of murder in the first degree is murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty. So I will now define the elements of that theory. You shall consider this theory of murder in the first degree regardless of whether or not you find the Commonwealth has proved murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. To prove that the defendant guilty of murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty, the Commonwealth must prove the following elements beyond a reasonable doubt. First, that the defendant caused the death of Ms. Ritzer. Second, that the defendant either intended to kill Ms. Ritzer or intended to cause grievous bodily harm to Ms. Ritzer or intended to do an act which in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. And the third element is that the killing was committed with extreme atrocity or cruelty. I will now discuss these elements in more detail. The first element is that the defendant caused the death of Ms. Ritzer. The defendant's act is the cause of Ms. Ritzer's death, where the act in natural and continuous sequence results in death, and without which death would not have occurred. The second element is that the defendant intended to kill Ms. Ritzer, or intended to cause grievous bodily harm to Ms. Ritzer, or intended to do an act which in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. As you can see, this second element has three sub-elements, which I shall call prongs, and the Commonwealth satisfies its burden of proof if it proves any one of the three prongs beyond a reasonable doubt. The first prong, that the defendant intended to kill, is the same as the second element of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. The second and third prongs are different from any elements of murder in the first degree with deliberate premeditation. The second prong is that the defendant intended to cause grievous bodily harm to Ms. Ritzer. Grievous bodily harm means severe injury to the body. The third element is that the defendant intended to enact, which in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. Let me help you understand how to analyze this third prong. You must first determine whether the defendant intended to perform the act that caused Ms. Ritzer's death. If you find he intended to perform the act, you must then determine what the defendant himself actually knew about the relevant circumstances at the time he acted. Then you must determine whether, under the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known that the acts intended by the defendant created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. In deciding whether the defendant intended to kill, intended to cause grievous bodily harm, or intended to do an act in which the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result, you may consider any credible evidence that the defendant suffered from a mental impairment. The defendant may form the requisite intent even if he suffered from a mental impairment, but you may consider such evidence in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved these elements. In deciding whether the defendant intended to kill, intended to cause, let me talk about the third element. The third element is that the killing was committed with extreme atrocity or cruelty. Extreme atrocity means an act that is extremely wicked or brutal, appalling, horrifying, or utterly revolting. Extreme cruelty means that the defendant caused the person's death by a method that surpassed cruelty inherent in the taking of human life. You must determine whether the method or mode of killing is so shocking as to amount to murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty. The inquiry focuses on the defendant's actions in terms of the manner and means of inflicting death and on the resulting effect on the alleged victim. In deciding whether the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant caused the death of the deceased with extreme atrocity or cruelty, you must consider the following factors. Whether the defendant was indifferent to or took pleasure in the suffering of the deceased. The conscious and degree of suffering of the deceased. The consciousness and degree of suffering of the deceased. 3, the extent of the injuries to the deceased. 3rd, the number of blows delivered. 5, the manner, degree, and severity of the force used. 6, the nature of the weapon, instrument, or method used. And 7, the disproportion between the means needed to cause death and those employed. The 7th factor refers to whether the means used were excessive and out of proportion to what would be needed to kill a person. You cannot make a finding of extreme atrocity or cruelty unless it is based on one or more of the factors I have just listed. You may consider the defendant's mental condition at the time of the killing, including any credible evidence of mental impairment, in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the killing with extreme atrocity or cruelty. After considering all the evidence in this case, if you find that the Commonwealth has proven beyond a reasonable doubt each of the 3 elements I have just defined, then you would find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree with extreme atrocity or cruelty. If, however, after considering all the evidence, you find that the Commonwealth has not proved any one of those 3 elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you would find the defendant not guilty of murder in the first degree with extreme atrocity or cruelty. If you do not find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree by deliberate premeditation or murder with extreme atrocity or cruelty, then you shall consider whether the Commonwealth has proved the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt of the lesser included offense of murder in the second degree. In order to prove murder in the second degree, the Commonwealth must prove the following elements. The defendant caused the death of Ms. Ritzer. Second, that the defendant intended to kill Ms. Ritzer or intended to cause her grievous bodily harm, or intended to do an act which, in the circumstances known to the defendant, a reasonable person would have known created a plain and strong likelihood that death would result. The requirements of proof for murder in the second degree are the same as for murder in the first degree with extreme atrocity or cruelty, but without the element that the killing was committed with extreme atrocity or cruelty. You may consider the defendant's mental condition at the time of the killing, including any credible evidence of mental impairment, in determining whether the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed murder in the second degree. If after considering all the evidence in the case you find that the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt each of the 2 elements I have just defined, then you would find the defendant guilty of murder in the second degree. If, however, after consideration of all the evidence you find the Commonwealth has not proved any one of those 2 elements beyond a reasonable doubt, you would find the defendant not guilty of murder in the second degree. The evidence convinces you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of a criminal offense. You have a duty to find the defendant guilty of the most serious offense that the Commonwealth has proved beyond a reasonable doubt. If the evidence does not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of any offense charged, you must find the defendant not guilty. Now, at this point in time, I'm going to turn to the third portion of the instructions. This is the shortest portion of the instructions, and after I finish them, I'm going to talk to the lawyers at the sidebar. The first thing I need to do is to select a foreperson of the jury, and the juror in seat 7, Mr. Richardson, will be the foreperson of this jury. You get no more honor for that, sir, or no more pay for that. However, you act as the chairperson of the board. You help organize the discussion. You make sure that everybody participates in the jury deliberations. That means all 12 sitting jurors participate in this manner, not just listening with seriousness and intensity and respect to your fellow jurors' views of the evidence, but that each juror share his or her views of the evidence. The four-person view of the evidence is no more or less important than the other sitting jurors. However, there are certain responsibilities that go with that position. In addition to organizing the discussion, you would fill out the verdict slip. Once you've reached a unanimous verdict, I will go over the verdict slip with you in a few moments. At this point in time, I want to talk about alternate jurors, because it's a long trial. We didn't know if it was going to go into Christmas week. We're required to select alternate jurors in a case, and some of you are going to be in the position of being alternate jurors, and that's difficult to be an alternate juror. It's difficult in an obvious way, in that you've all worked so hard and been so serious about your jury duty, and to be chosen as an alternate juror is difficult after you've invested your heart and soul, your intellect, your time, and your effort into this case. But the second thing I want to point out about being an alternate juror is that your duty is not done if you're an alternate juror. It is not infrequent that alternate jurors become sitting jurors. It is not infrequent that alternate jurors become sitting jurors. So if you are an alternate juror, there are two instructions I give you. They're both very difficult. And the second one is just as important as the first. As an alternate juror, you can't discuss the case with anybody else. You can't do any independent investigation concerning this case. You have to continue to comport yourself at every moment as you would expect a judge of the facts to do so, because you may become a sitting juror in the case. The second requirement of being an alternate juror is also very difficult. 4 of you are going to be alternate jurors, if my math is correct. Actually, 5 of you are going to be alternate jurors, and you're going to be spending a lot of time with each other if you're alternate jurors. And while you can certainly talk about whatever you want, tomorrow I expect you'll bring some reading in, but the one thing you can't talk about at all at any point in time is your view of the evidence. That is incredibly important. Alternate jurors become sitting jurors more often than you'd think. And the alternate juror has to go into the jury room pure as the driven snow, not having talked about the case with anybody else. So it's imperative, if you're an alternate juror, that you not discuss the case among yourselves with anybody else. Now, a few years ago, we moved from our decrepit courthouse down the road that was built in 1841 to this new building. And when we did, nothing came with us except for this box right here that we used to choose alternate jurors. I don't point that out as some sort of historical footnote or as an aside. I point it out to tell you that since that building was built in 1841, since we started having jury trials in this Commonwealth, there have been alternate jurors. And I know if you are chosen as an alternate juror, you'll recognize the importance of continuing to conduct yourself as you would expect people who may well become sitting jurors in the case. The alternate jurors are chosen randomly, and Ms. Draper at this point in time, taking the foreperson of the jury, who from this point in time will sit in seat 16, out, choose the alternate jurors, please.
The following jurors have been selected as alternates. Jurors in seat number 1, number 4, number 5, number 9, and number 13.
Jurors, could you come forward with your notebooks? Those jurors who were called. Let me see here. If you would, please.
If you have any questions for me, I'm not suggesting that you should, but if you have any questions for me, the questions would be reduced to writing, signed and dated, and the time put on the question by the foreperson of the jury. If you do have any questions for me, I'm not suggesting you should, but if you do have any questions for me, do not indicate to the court or anybody where you stand numerically or otherwise in your deliberations until you are ready to return a verdict in this case. It is critically important that all 12 of you participate in the jury deliberations. So if anybody has to step out for his or her personal comfort, it's imperative that the conversation stop. Now, nobody's going to let a word be spoken when if you have to step out for your personal comfort or because you have to address something unrelated to the case. But it is the foreperson's role and the jury's role as a whole to make sure that the deliberations include all 12 deliberating jurors. Along those lines, I have no comment to make at all about the pace of your deliberations. No comment to make now, no comment to make about the pace of your deliberations ever. But if you do not reach a verdict today and you're released until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning and all 12 of you are here, you may not discuss the case at all when you all arrive until I release you back to formal jury deliberations. When you get here in the morning, if you do not reach a verdict today, when you go home and you come back in the morning, all 12 of you are there. Do not discuss the case in any way until I have returned you to formal jury deliberations. We need all the jurors and alternate jurors here before I can do that. Now, when you get in that jury room and you start to talk about this case, when you're sitting around that table, you're going to be struck almost immediately by the seriousness, by the conscientiousness of your fellow jurors, by your collective intelligence, your collective wisdom, your collective memory, and your commitment to this case. So when you walk into that room and you start to talk about the case, listen with respect and intensity and seriousness to your fellow jurors and share your views and keep an open mind as you have those discussions. I need a few minutes to talk to the lawyers at the sidebar, and then I'll have a couple of more comments to make here. Let's just make sure that's on. Okay, I may need to speak to the lawyers again. If I do, it'll just be for a moment. So, Mr. Foreperson, again, you'll sit in seat 16 every time you come in from this point on. You'll have the verdict slip and fill out the verdict slip once you've reached a unanimous verdict as to all of the charges. Your verdict, whether it's guilty or not guilty, as to each indictment must be unanimous. All 12 sitting jurors must agree. So as it relates to murder in the first degree, your verdict would be either not guilty, guilty of the offenses charged by deliberate premeditation only, or deliberate premeditation and extreme atrocity, or guilty of the lesser included offense of murder in the second degree, or not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility. The foreperson is going to be in seat 17. I'm having a little bit of a math challenge today, evidently. Okay, as to the aggravated rape, there's two separate indictments for aggravated rape. You have to look at both indictments separately, and you must be unanimous whether your verdict is guilty or not guilty. If it's not guilty, you check off not guilty, guilty of the offenses charged, or not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility. If you find guilty as charged, then you'd go to Part B, and you'd only go to Part B again if you found the defendant guilty. And then, if so, you would have to determine whether or not the defendant was between the ages of 14 and 18 at the time, on October 22nd, 2013, and the parties have stipulated to that age. And then Part C, that you need to determine whether the offense charged involved infliction of serious bodily injury or threat of serious bodily harm by the juvenile defendant. So that's as to aggravated rape, again, looking at each indictment separately, the allegation in the bathroom and the allegation in the woods. And as it relates to armed robbery, again, your verdict would have to be unanimous, whether it's not guilty, guilty of the offenses charged, or guilty of the lesser offense of larceny, or not guilty by reason of lack of criminal responsibility. Since this is a youthful offender indictment, you'd also have to agree beyond a reasonable doubt, as with the other youthful offender indictments for aggravated rape, whether the defendant was between 14 and 18 years old, and the parties have stipulated as such that he was. And then you would also have to unanimously determine whether the Commonwealth has proven or not, whether or not the offense charged involved infliction of serious bodily injury or threat of bodily harm. So those are the verdict slips that you'll be required to fill out. Ladies and gentlemen, in a moment, you're going to be a deliberating jury. Does counsel need to see me at all before? No? Okay. In a moment, you're going to be a deliberating jury. You're going to get into that jury room, and I know when you get around that table, you'll bring to bear what I've been talking about every moment since you first came in to court. That you bring to this awesome responsibility that you have the best that's in you, the best that you can be. That you consider the evidence, find the facts from the evidence, apply those facts to law as I instruct you in order to return a verdict in this case. Ms. Draper, if the court officers could please be sworn.
Yes, Your Honor. Do you solemnly swear that you will keep this jury in some convenient place until they are agreed, and that you will not suffer any person to speak to them, nor speak to them yourself unless by order of the court, or to ask them if they have agreed? And when they have agreed, you will return them into court unless the court shall otherwise order, so help you God.
I do. Mr. Foreperson, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you may retire to your deliberations.
All rise. Jurors, you'll be taking your notebooks with you. Jurors, if you'll just remain a moment, you may stand. Sir, if you'll lead out, watch your steps going out.
I think I'll come out. We'll come back out after council is content with the first steps and the exhibits. Colleen Ritzer.
All right.
Mr. Foreman, what say you to indictment number 2013-1446, charging the defendant, Philip Chism, with murder in the first degree? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty? And if guilty, guilty of what? On what theory?
Guilty, deliberate premeditation, and extreme atrocity with cruelty.
Mr. Foreman, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, hearken to your verdict as the court has recorded it. You, upon your oaths, do say that the defendant, Philip Chism, is guilty of deliberate premeditation and extreme atrocity, cruelty on indictment number 2013-1446, charging him with murder in the first degree. So say you, Mr. Foreman?
Yes.
So say you, all members of the jury?
Yes.
Ms. Regan?
May the jury be polled?
Maybe.
That's fine. You may be seated, ladies and gentlemen, as well as the alternates.
Time to be seated during the polling, and then when we go to the next verdict.
Juror number 2, would you please stand, sir? What say you on indictment number 2013-1446, charging the defendant, Philip Chism, of murder in the first degree? Is he guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Thank you. You may be seated, sir. Juror number 3, what say you on indictment number 2013-1446, charging the defendant, Philip Chism, of murder in the first degree? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Thank you, sir. You may be seated. Juror number 6, what say you on indictment number 2013-1446, charging the defendant of murder? Guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Thank you. Juror number 7, what say you? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty on indictment number 2013-1446, charging him of murder?
Guilty.
Thank you. Juror number 8, what say you on indictment number 2013-1446, charging the defendant of murder? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Thank you. Juror number 10, what say you on indictment number 2013-1446, charging the defendant with murder in the first degree? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Juror number 11, what say you on indictment number 2013-1446, charging the defendant with murder in the first degree? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Thank you. Juror number 12, what say you? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty on indictment number 2013-1446, charging him with murder in the first degree?
Guilty.
Juror number 14, what say you on indictment number 2013-1446, charging the defendant of murder in the first degree? Is he guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Juror number 15, what say you on indictment number 2013-1446, charging the defendant of murder in the first degree? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
And juror number 16, what say you? The defendant guilty on is the defendant guilty or not guilty on indictment number 2013-1446, charging him with murder in the first degree?
Guilty.
And Your Honor, Mr. Foreman had already been pulled in hearken to the verdict. Would you all please stand? Mr. Foreman, what say you? I'm sorry. Mr. Chism, would you please stand, sir? Mr. Foreman, what say you to indictment number 2013-1447001, charging the defendant with aggravated rape? Is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Mr. Foreman and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, hearken to your verdict as the court has recorded it. You, upon your oaths, do say that the defendant, Philip Chism, is not guilty on indictment number 2013-1447001, charging him with aggravated rape. So say you, Mr. Foreman?
Yes.
So say you, all members of the jury.
Yes.
Could we have
001.
001?
Aggravated rape in the woods. Do that again. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, hearken to your verdict as the court has recorded it. You, upon your oaths, do say that the defendant, Philip Chism, is not guilty on indictment number 2013-1447001, charging with aggravated rape to it in the woods. So say you say he is not guilty. So say you, Mr. Foreman.
Yes.
So say you, all members of the jury.
Yes.
On indictment 2013-1447002, charging the defendant with armed robbery. Mr. Foreman, what say you, is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Mr. Foreman and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, hearken to your verdict as the court has recorded it. You, upon your oaths, do say that the defendant, Philip Chism, is guilty on indictment number 2013-1447002, charging him with armed robbery. So say you, Mr. Foreman.
Yes.
So say you, all members of the jury.
Yes.
Madam Clerk, we do not request polling.
Thank you, Ms. Regan. Mr. Foreman, on indictment number 2014-109, charging the defendant, Philip Chism, with aggravated rape. What say you, is the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Guilty.
Mr. Foreman and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, hearken to your verdict as the court has recorded it. You, upon your oaths, do say the defendant, Philip Chism, is guilty on indictment number 2014-109, charging him with aggravated rape. So say you, Mr. Foreman.
Yes.
So say you, all members of the jury.
Yes.
The defendant does not request polling on this matter.
Your Honor, may the verdicts be recorded. Have the papers, please, Mr.
Foreperson, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please be seated. Mr. Foreperson, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I have no comment, obviously, to make on your verdict, but I can't help but comment on the seriousness with which each of you and the alternate jurors has taken the awesome responsibility that each of you has had in this case. Serving on a jury is probably the highest prerogative of citizenship, other than serving your nation in a time of war. Each of you and all the alternate jurors gave this case everything you had. I asked you when I first saw you to bring to bear in this case the best that's in you, the best that you could be. And it's as clear to me from the first day throughout this trial that you've all done that. Judge Irving Younger once called a trial an opportunity to see government become manifest and palpable for the citizens to see. And that's why we have a public courtroom, for the citizens to see. And what citizens saw in this case are jurors who came into court not expecting that they might be on a case of this nature, reached down, worked hard day after day, and gave this case everything that you had. On behalf of everybody involved in this case and on behalf of your country, which country you are, I want to thank you all very much for your jury service, and I'll take a few minutes before I come in and talk to you personally. Jurors are excused.
All rise. Jurors, sir, if you lead out, watch your step going up. Court will remain in session. You may be seated.
Your Honor, may the defendant be discharged.
On indictment.
Indictment 2013.
Yes, please, Ms. Draper.
Philip Chism, the jury having returned a verdict of not guilty on indictment number 2013-1447, count 1, charging with aggravated rape. The court orders that you be discharged of this indictment and this indictment only, and go thereof without delay.
Ms. McDougall and Ms. Regan, if we could schedule the matter for sentencing, please.
Yes, the defense would be requesting a pre-sentence investigation. It's required for the youthful offender convictions, and I'd urge the court that it would be very helpful, and we requested to put our best foot forward as far as the parole eligibility issue on the first-degree murder.
And how much time are you asking for?
Well, I believe the pre-sentence investigation will be done by the probation department, and I imagine they need a few weeks.
I would just point out that there's nothing I can do about the fact that he is entitled to a pre-sentencing report, but it's not as to the first-degree murder, it's as to the youthful offender indictment. So if the reason being stated for it is as to the first-degree murder, that seems to be a little inaccurate. He is entitled, unfortunately, under the statute. It's a little hard for me to imagine, as we stand here today, what more we could know about Philip Chism, given the number of reports we've all had an opportunity to review already, and I would be urging the court to set the sentencing as soon a date as possible.
Okay. All right. It seems to me that, well, the statute requires, what is it, at least 7 days?
7 days after the report is complete.
Mm-hmm. And I think what we have to do is talk to probation and talk to Chief Probation Officer Wallace and find out what the period of time that's necessary. I think the best thing to do is to set this case for a short status date so that I can talk to Mr. Wallace and do it in open court. As it relates to the issue of the first-degree murder, I assume that there's going to be an allocution from numerous people, and I'd rather the allocution take place all at once.
I completely agree on that, Your Honor. I'm just urging the court, given the number of delays we've already faced, that we do it as soon as humanly possible.
And that's why I want to set a status date and talk to Mr. Wallace in court so that nothing happens behind closed doors about how much time it can realistically take.
And we do need, and I think given the amount of time I suspect it takes for a pre-sentence report, we would need approximately 2 weeks to brief the issue of parole eligibility and other matters concerning sentencing.
All right, well, I'm not sure that how that correlates with necessarily with the aid in sentencing. It may be that they can both move along to some degree at the same time, but I certainly want to talk to Chief Wallace about being comprehensive, but being as expeditious as he can be as well. So if we could have a short status date on the case, that would be helpful, and we'll move toward the sentencing stage as quickly as we can do it fairly to the Commonwealth and fairly to the defendant. Are you available next week, Ms. McDougall?
Yeah.
And Ms. Regan?
Yes, with the 21st. Oh, that's the Monday, I'm sorry, the 22nd.
Is that good for you?
22nd.
I'll make myself available.
Okay. All right, December 22nd at 10:30 then for status relative to sentencing.
May Mr. Chism's presence be excused for that?
It may.
Thank you.
All right. Court will be in recess.
All rise.